Good evening and welcome back to Just About History. Tonight we are going somewhere that most people think they already know. A word so embedded in modern language that we use it without ever wondering where it came from. Assassination, assassin. It rolls off the tongue easily, casually, the way old words do when they have been borrowed so many times that nobody remembers who owned them first. But tonight we are going to find out. We are going to trace that word all the way back to its origin, back to a cold mountain in northern Persia, back to a man whose name history has never quite been able to decide how to pronounce, back to a movement so strange and so perfectly constructed that even the most powerful empires on earth could not figure out how to destroy it. Before we begin, if you are enjoying what we do here at Just About History, take just a moment to like this video and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means everything for keeping these stories alive and finding their way to people who need them. And before we drift into tonight's story, drop your location and your local time in the comments below. There is something quietly beautiful about knowing that people all across the world are settling in at the same moment, letting the same story wash over them. You might even help a fellow insomniac find their way here tonight. So go ahead and get comfortable now. Adjust your pillow, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, pull the blanket a little closer if the night is cool. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do. Tonight we are travelling back roughly 1,000 years, to a world that looked almost nothing like ours, and yet was driven by the exact same forces that drive ours. Power, faith, fear, and the desperate human hunger to matter. Tonight we begin the entire story of the assassins. And we begin not with a killing, but with a crack that had been forming for 400 years. To understand the assassins, truly understand them, not just the legend but the living, breathing organisation that terrified the medieval world, you have to understand the world they were born into, and that world was broken. Not broken in the obvious way, not crumbling walls and burning cities, though there was plenty of that too. Broken in the deeper way. Broken along a fault line of faith that ran straight through the heart of Islam and had been splitting it slowly, quietly, catastrophically apart since the 7th century. It begins with a death. The way so many of history's deepest wounds begin. In the year 632, the Prophet Muhammad died in the city of Medina without leaving a clear, unambiguous instruction about who should lead the community of believers after him. What followed was not immediate chaos, but something quieter and in some ways more dangerous, a disagreement about legitimacy, about who had the right to lead, about what leadership even meant in a faith that was barely a generation old and already reshaping the world. A large portion of the early Muslim community believed that leadership should pass to Abu Bakr, one of the Prophet's closest companions and father-in-law. He was elected, he led, and the line of leaders that followed him became known as the caliphs, successors. This community would eventually be known as Sunni Muslims, and for much of Islamic history they would represent the majority. But another portion of that early community believed something different. They believed that leadership had already been designated, that the Prophet had, before his death, indicated that his cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, should lead the faithful. Ali was not just family. He was, in the eyes of his supporters, the rightful heir to a spiritual as well as political authority. A man uniquely qualified by blood, by closeness, by divine selection to guide the community forward. Ali's supporters called themselves Shi'at Ali, the party of Ali, shortened over centuries to simply Shia. For a while the wound was manageable. Abu Bakr led, then Umar, then Uthman, and then, finally, Ali himself became the fourth caliph. And for a moment it seemed as though the tension might ease. It did not. Ali's reign was contested from the beginning, plagued by civil war, and he was assassinated in 661 by a member of a radical faction in the Mosque of Kufa. His son Hassan renounced the caliphate under pressure. And then, in 680, came the event that would define the Shia soul forever. Karbala. Ali's younger son, Hussein, refused to pledge allegiance to the Umayyad Caliph Yazid, a man many considered morally unfit to lead the faithful. Hussein marched toward Kufa with a small group of family and followers, somewhere between 70 and a few hundred people, depending on the source, believing that the people there would rise to support him. They did not. Instead, Hussein and his companions were met at the plain of Karbala by an Umayyad army numbering in the thousands. They were surrounded, cut off from water, and on the 10th day of the Islamic month of Muharram, they were massacred. Hussein himself was killed, his head taken as a trophy, his body left on the sand. The massacre at Karbala did not break the Shia movement. It forged it, hardened it into something that persecution could not dissolve, because persecution had become part of its identity. Hussein's death was not merely a military defeat. It became a cosmic tragedy, a martyrdom that gave the Shia faith its most defining emotional core, the willingness to suffer for truth, the understanding that righteousness did not guarantee survival, the belief that the world was fundamentally unjust and that justice would eventually, inevitably come. Every year, Shia Muslims around the world still commemorate the day of Karbala through the observance of Ashura, a day of mourning so raw and so genuine that it has survived 13 centuries essentially intact. But grief, however powerful, is not a political program, and the Shia community in the centuries after Karbala needed more than grief. They needed a theology, a framework, a way of understanding their position in a world where they were almost always the minority, almost always the persecuted, almost always waiting for a justice that kept not arriving. That framework developed gradually, and one of its most important features was the concept of the Imam. Not Imam in the everyday sense of a prayer leader, but Imam with a capital I, a divinely guided leader descended from the Prophet's family, from Ali's bloodline, who carried not just political authority, but spiritual authority. The Imam was the interpreter of divine truth, the living connection between the human world and the sacred. Without the Imam, the community was in some sense spiritually incomplete. The question of which member of Ali's bloodline was the rightful Imam led, over time, to further divisions within the Shia community itself. Most Shia Muslims today are Twelvers. They believe in a line of 12 Imams, the last of whom went into a state of occultation in the 9th century and will return at the end of time. But another branch, smaller and in many ways more theologically adventurous, parted ways with the Twelvers over the question of the 6th Imam's succession in the 8th century. The 6th Imam, Jafar al-Sadiq, had a son named Ismail, whom many expected to succeed him. Ismail died before his father, and most of Jafar's followers transferred their loyalty to another son. But a significant group refused. They insisted that the imamate had already been designated to Ismail, that it belonged to his bloodline, and that this line of succession must be followed regardless. These were the Ismailis, sometimes called Seveners, for the 7 Imams they recognize in the direct line. And it is from this community, this determined minority within a minority strand of Islamic thought, that the assassins would eventually emerge. The Ismailis were from the beginning a movement that attracted the intellectually restless, the spiritually hungry, and the politically disenfranchised. Their theology was not simple. It was layered, esoteric, deeply influenced by Neoplatonist philosophy, and organised around the idea that religious texts had both an outer meaning accessible to everyone and an inner meaning accessible only to those initiated into the deeper teaching. The Quran said one thing on the surface, but beneath the surface, for those with the knowledge and the guidance of the true Imam, it said something else, something richer, more complex, more demanding. This esoteric approach made the Ismaili movement simultaneously attractive and dangerous. Attractive because it offered intellectual depth and a sense of belonging to a special community of understanding. Dangerous because the Sunni majority regarded it with deep suspicion, as heresy, as subversion, as a deliberate attempt to destabilize the foundations of Islamic society. And in this suspicion lay the seeds of the violence that would eventually define the century in which Hassan-i Sabbah was born. Now hold that religious landscape in your mind for a moment, and set it against the political one. Because in the 11th century, the political landscape of the Islamic world was not much more stable than the theological one. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had replaced the Umayyads in 750 and established its magnificent capital at Baghdad, was by the mid-11th century a hollow shell of its former glory. The caliphs still sat on their thrones, still received ambassadors, still issued proclamations in the name of Islamic authority. But real power had long since migrated elsewhere. The caliphate had become a ceremonial institution, spiritually significant, politically neutered. The force that had hollowed it out was the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were a Turkic dynasty from the steppes of Central Asia who had converted to Sunni Islam and then proceeded to conquer most of the Middle East with startling speed. By 1055 their leader Tughril had entered Baghdad and received the title of Sultan from the Abbasid Caliph, effectively making himself the military and administrative ruler of the Islamic heartland, while leaving the Caliph as a figurehead. The Seljuks went on to defeat the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, seizing most of Anatolia, and at their height-controlled territory stretching from Central Asia to the Mediterranean coast. Seljuk rule was not uniformly oppressive. The dynasty produced sophisticated administrators, patronized scholars and poets, and built some of the most beautiful architecture of the medieval Islamic world. But for the Shah and Ismaili communities in particular, Seljuk dominance was a serious problem. The Seljuks were aggressively Sunni, enthusiastically orthodox, and deeply hostile to what they regarded as Ismaili heresy. The great Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk, one of the most capable administrators the medieval world produced, made the suppression of Ismaili influence a policy priority. Ismaili missionaries were persecuted, their communities harassed, their leaders hunted. And it was into this world of Sunni political dominance, Shia marginalization, Ismaili persecution, and simmering theological tension that Hassan-i Sabbah was born. Probably around 1050. Almost certainly in the city of Qom, one of the holiest cities in Shah Islam, in what is now Iran. We know relatively little about Hassan's early life with certainty. Most of what has survived comes from hostile sources, Sunni historians who had every reason to paint him as darkly as possible, or from later legends that have been elaborated by centuries of retelling. But some things seem clear enough. Hassan was born into a family with Shia sympathies, though his father appears to have nominally practiced a Twelver Shia affiliation at a time when Ismaili belief was dangerous to advertise openly. He was educated, serious, and from an early age drawn to theological questions with an intensity that went beyond ordinary religious observance. He was the kind of young man who did not merely believe, he needed to understand why he believed, to test his beliefs against every argument, to find the bedrock of certainty beneath the shifting sands of doctrine. As a young man in the city of Ray, near modern Tehran, Hassan encountered Ismaili missionaries. The Ismailis ran a sophisticated missionary network called the Dawah, the Call, which operated semi-secretly across the Islamic world, identifying promising recruits and drawing them gradually into the deeper layers of Ismaili teaching. The missionaries were educated, persuasive, and trained to engage with exactly the kind of intellectually restless young men that Hassan represented. The accounts of Hassan's conversion vary. Some sources suggest he was resistant at first, that he wrestled with the Ismaili arguments, that he underwent a period of genuine spiritual crisis before the Ismaili framework clicked into place and gave him what he had been searching for, a coherent, layered, demanding theology that felt like truth. Others suggest his conversion was faster, more visceral, triggered by an illness that he survived and interpreted as a sign. What all accounts agree on is that once Hassan committed, he committed completely. There was no halfway position for him, no comfortable middle ground. He gave himself to the Ismaili cause with the total dedication of a man who has found the thing he was made for. He rose quickly within the movement. He was sent to study in Egypt, where the Ismaili Fatimid Caliphate had established a rival centre of Islamic power in Cairo, a Shia caliphate that styled itself as the true alternative to the Abbasid Seljuk order. The Fatimids were at this point still a significant power, controlling Egypt, much of North Africa, and parts of the Levant. Their court at Cairo was a centre of learning and theological sophistication, and for an ambitious young Ismaili missionary, a period of study there was both an education and a credential. Hassan spent several years in Egypt, absorbing everything he could. He studied theology, mathematics, astronomy, and the art of the Dawah, the missionary practice of drawing people toward the inner teaching through careful, graduated revelation. He was brilliant, difficult, and politically combustible. The sources suggest he fell out with the Fatimid court, possibly over the question of succession to the imamate, which was itself contested, and was eventually expelled and sent back to Persia. What he brought back with him was not just knowledge, it was a vision, a plan. Something more radical than anything the Ismaili movement had attempted before. The plan grew from a clear-eyed assessment of the situation. The Ismailis in Persia were a minority within a minority, scattered across a landscape dominated by their enemies, without the military or political power to challenge the Seljuks in any conventional way. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, which should have been their protector and their patron, was too distant, too absorbed in its own internal politics, and increasingly too weak to offer meaningful support. Conventional paths to power, armies, alliances, political negotiation, were not available to a community this marginalized. But Hassan had studied something in his years of theological education and missionary work that most political thinkers of his era had not thought to weaponize. He had studied the relationship between fear and power, between the visible and the invisible, between what an enemy knows and what an enemy imagines. A small force with conventional weapons is simply a small force. It can be identified, surrounded, and destroyed. But a small force that cannot be located, whose members cannot be distinguished from ordinary citizens, whose strikes are precise and seemingly unpredictable, whose reach appears to extend everywhere, that force is not small at all. That force is something else entirely. That force is something that lives in the imagination of every enemy, and the imagination is a place that no army can occupy. Hassan was, in the most precise sense of the word, going to build something that had never quite existed before. Not a conventional army, not a network of overt political resistance, something stranger and more durable, a movement built on absolute loyalty, esoteric knowledge, perfect discipline, and the strategic use of targeted violence. But first he needed a base, a place. Somewhere high and defensible, and remote enough to build in without being destroyed before the foundations had set. He found it in 1090. And the name of that place would become one of the most resonant words in medieval history: Alamut. The word, in the local dialect, means something like eagle's nest, and it earns the name. Alamut Castle sits on a narrow ridge of rock in the Alborz Mountains of northern Persia, at an elevation of roughly 2,000 metres, overlooking a long, fertile valley below. The approaches to it are steep and difficult. The rock it sits on rises sharply from the ridge, creating a natural fortification that stone walls merely completed. From a distance, in certain lights, it looks less like something built, and more like something that grew there, like the mountain itself decided to raise a fist toward the sky. Hassan did not take Alamut by force. That is the detail that most accounts bury, and it is perhaps the most revealing thing about how his mind worked. The castle was at the time garrisoned by a Seljuk-aligned commander and controlled a valley whose population included a significant number of Ismaili sympathizers. Hassan sent missionaries into the valley ahead of himself, quietly, carefully, over a period of months. By the time he arrived personally in 1090, he had already converted enough of the local population, and even some of the garrison's own soldiers, that the castle was, in a meaningful sense, already his. The commander found himself outnumbered from within, outmaneuvered without a battle having been fought, and was escorted out of his own fortress. Hassan reportedly offered him a note for 3,000 gold dinars in compensation, a gesture so cool and so precise that it reads almost like a joke, except that Hassan was not a man given to jokes. He walked into Alamut Castle in 1090, and he would not leave it for the next 35 years. Not once. Not for any reason. From that cold, high, magnificent rock, Hassan-i Sabbah would proceed to construct something the medieval world had never seen, and the world would spend the next 2 centuries trying to figure out how to make it stop. The valley below Alamut was everything a revolutionary movement needed. Long and well watered, sheltered by mountains on either side, producing enough food to sustain a community without dependence on outside supply. Hassan understood immediately that self-sufficiency was survival. A movement that needed to trade with its enemies was a movement that could be strangled. He organized the valley's agriculture carefully, built irrigation systems, planted orchards, established workshops. Alamut was not going to be a fortress in the conventional sense, a military installation sustained by tribute and supply lines. It was going to be a self-contained world. And within that world, Hassan began constructing the most unusual human organization of the medieval period. The order was built on hierarchy, so precise it functioned almost like a machine. At the top was Hassan himself, the Grand Master, the representative of the hidden Imam on earth, the source of all authority and all teaching. Below him was a carefully graduated series of initiates, each level knowing more of the inner teaching than the level below, each level holding a correspondingly greater degree of commitment and responsibility. The system was designed so that no single defection could compromise the whole. A low-level initiate knew only what was necessary for his function. He was loyal because he was slowly, carefully drawn into a community of belief and belonging, because each revelation of the inner teaching felt like a gift, because the sense of being among the few who truly understood was intoxicating in a way that no amount of money or physical comfort could replicate. At the lowest level of initiation were the Lazics, the attached ones, ordinary community members, sympathizers, people who believed in the cause without yet being fully inside the organization. Above them were the Rafiqs, the companions, more fully initiated, more trusted, more deeply embedded in the community's inner life. Above them were the Dice, the missionaries, the active propagators of the faith, the men who went out into the world and found new recruits and drew them carefully inward. And then there were the fidai. The word means, roughly, one who sacrifices himself. And the fidai were exactly what that name suggests, the devoted ones, the operatives, the men trained and prepared to carry out the physical acts that would make the outside world understand that the assassins were not an abstraction. The fidai were young, almost always drawn from within the community itself, selected for intelligence, physical capability, and a quality of personal devotion that Hassan's people had learned to identify and cultivate. They were trained in languages, in customs, in the ability to pass as members of whatever community they were sent to penetrate. Some trained for years before being deployed. Some spent months or years inside an enemy court, building trust, becoming invisible, before the moment came, because the moment always came. That was the point. The genius, and it is not too strong a word, of what Hassan built was that the weapon was not the blade. The blade was just the final moment of a process that had begun months or years earlier. The real weapon was the knowledge that the blade could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. That no court was safe, no bodyguard sufficient, no distance adequate. The real weapon was the feeling of a hand on your shoulder in a crowd and not knowing whose hand it was. This is where the legend begins to diverge from the reality, and it is worth pausing here to address the divergence directly. Because the story of the assassins has been buried under so many layers of myth, fabrication, and deliberate misrepresentation that the truth requires some careful excavation. The most famous legend about the assassins, the one that Marco Polo popularized in the 13th century and that European imagination seized upon with extraordinary enthusiasm, is the story of the garden. According to this legend, Hassan maintained a secret garden of paradise at Alamut, filled with beautiful things, flowing water, fruit trees, beautiful young women, every sensory pleasure imaginable. Recruits were drugged, transported to this garden while unconscious, allowed to experience its pleasures for a period, and then removed and told that they had been granted a taste of paradise. Having experienced it, they were willing to do anything, including die on Hassan's command, to return to it. The Arabic word for hashish, the legend suggested, gave the order its name. Hashishin, the hashish users, which became, in the European ear, assassins. It is a wonderful story. It is almost certainly not true. Modern historians have found no contemporary Islamic sources that describe this garden. The hashish connection appears to have been introduced by hostile critics and later elaborated by travellers like Marco Polo, who were working from hearsay several generations removed from the actual events. The word hashishin, when used in contemporary sources, appears to have been a term of abuse, roughly equivalent to calling someone a lowlife or a rabble-rouser, rather than a literal description of drug use. There is no credible evidence that the assassins used hashish as part of their initiation or operational practice. What there is evidence of is something less dramatic, but more interesting. The fidai were motivated not by drugs, but by theology, by the genuine, deeply held belief that they were serving the hidden imam, that their actions were cosmically justified, that death in the service of this cause was not a loss but a transformation. Hassan was an extraordinarily effective theologian and psychologist. He did not need to drug anyone. He built a community of meaning so total and so carefully graduated that the men inside it were prepared to die not because they had been tricked into bravery, but because they had been genuinely intellectually convinced of something worth dying for. That is harder to sensationalize than a garden of paradise. It is also considerably more frightening. By the time Hassan had spent a decade at Alamut, the order was already operating across a significant portion of Persia. Missionaries were moving through Seljuk-controlled territory, identifying sympathizers, establishing safe houses, recruiting. Other mountain fortresses had been acquired through the same mixture of patient infiltration and negotiation that had delivered Alamut. The assassins were building not just a fortress, but a network, a distributed system of nodes that could function independently even if one was captured or destroyed. And the outside world was beginning to notice. The Seljuk response was what you would expect from a military power confronted with a threat it did not quite understand. They sent armies to lay siege to Alamut. The sieges failed. The mountain was too defensible, the supply lines too well organized, the garrison too committed. The Seljuks tried interdiction, blocking the valley's trade routes, attempting to starve the community out. Hassan's agricultural self-sufficiency absorbed that blow too. They tried negotiation, offering terms, attempting to bring Hassan's movement within the existing political order. Hassan was not interested in the existing political order. He intended to replace it. And then, in 1092, he gave the world its first clear demonstration of what he had actually built. His target was Nizam al-Mulk, the Great Vizier, the most powerful man in the Seljuk Empire after the Sultan himself, the architect of Seljuk administrative dominance, the man who had made the suppression of Ismaili influence a policy, a man so central to the functioning of the Seljuk state that his removal would send a shock through the entire structure. A fidai was sent. He approached Nizam al-Mulk disguised as a Sufi mystic, requesting an audience. The vizier received him. The fidai stabbed him. Nizam al-Mulk died of his wounds that same night, the first major political assassination carried out by the order that would take its name, in the distorted European rendering from this moment and the ones that followed. The Sultan died less than a month later, possibly of shock, possibly of illness exacerbated by grief. The Seljuk Empire, deprived simultaneously of its greatest administrator and its ruler, began a long, disorderly fragmentation into rival successor states. The world had just learned something important, and Hassan-i Sabbah, sitting in his cold mountain fortress in the Alborz, had only just begun. Outside, the night is quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes in after the world has finished its business and before it has remembered to start again. You might already be feeling the edges of sleep beginning to soften things, the details blurring slightly, the story becoming something you are floating inside rather than following. That is exactly where we want you. We have set the stage now. We know the world that made Hassan. We know the fault lines of faith that ran beneath it. We know how he built his order from a cold mountain and a community of devoted believers, and we know how he announced himself to history with a blade in the dark. But the story of the assassins is only beginning. Because building something extraordinary is one thing. Sustaining it, expanding it, turning it into a force that empires must negotiate with rather than simply destroy, that is something else entirely. And in the mountains of Persia, as the Seljuk Empire began its slow fracture, and the Crusaders arrived on the shores of the Holy Land, and the medieval world rearranged itself in ways nobody had predicted, Hassan-i Sabbah was already thinking several moves ahead, already sending his missionaries into new territories, already identifying the next fortress, the next recruit, the next target. The mountain had spoken, Now it was time for the network to grow. There is something about a mountain that does things to a person's sense of time. Down in the valleys, in the cities, time moves the way cities make it move, in the rhythm of markets opening and closing, of prayers called 5 times a day, of caravans arriving and departing, of messengers bringing news that is already old by the time it arrives. Time in the city is transactional. It is measured in what gets done and what does not. But up on a mountain, especially a mountain like Alamut, time becomes something different. The clouds move through at eye level. The valley below looks like a map of itself. The wind comes from directions that have no names in the languages of the lowlands, and a man sitting on that ridge, looking out over the Alborz range in the early years of the 11th century, could be forgiven for feeling that he was not quite inside ordinary history anymore, that he was watching it from a sufficient distance to see its shapes, the patterns that the people inside it could never see because they were too close, too embedded, too busy surviving to step back and observe. Hassan-i Sabbah had been on that mountain for years now. He had not left. He would not leave. And in the stillness of Alamut, in the cold air and the austere routine of a man who had reduced his own life to its absolute essentials, he was doing something that would outlast nearly everything his contemporaries were building in the valleys below. He was thinking, and what he was thinking about was this: how do you build a movement that cannot be destroyed? The question was not abstract for Hassan, it was the most practical question imaginable, because the forces that wanted to destroy his movement were real and present and enormous. The Seljuk Empire, even in its post-Nizam al-Mulk fragmentation, still commanded armies that dwarfed anything the assassins could put in the field. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad still wielded the ideological authority to declare the Ismailis heretics and give religious sanction to their persecution. The broader Sunni world regarded the Ismaili movement with a suspicion that shaded easily into murderous hostility. A conventional military organization would have been ground to dust already. A conventional political movement would have been negotiated into irrelevance or suppressed into silence. Hassan had watched both happen to Ismaili communities across Persia and beyond, watched them compromise, accommodate, shrink, and finally disappear into the larger order they had failed to change. He was not going to make that mistake. And the reason he was not going to make that mistake was that he had understood something about power that most of his contemporaries had not. Power, Hassan understood, was not fundamentally about force. Force was merely the most obvious expression of power, the most visible, the most legible, the most easily countered. A force can always be met with a larger force. An army can always be faced with a bigger army. But there was another kind of power, subtler and in many ways more durable, that operated not through force, but through the management of uncertainty. Through the cultivation of a specific quality of fear, not the fear of a known threat that can be prepared for, but the fear of a threat that cannot be located, cannot be predicted, and cannot be neutralized, because it does not look like a threat until the moment it strikes. This was not entirely original. Assassinations had occurred throughout human history. Political violence as a tool of statecraft was not new. What Hassan was doing that was genuinely new was systematizing it, turning it from an improvised act of desperation into a precision instrument of strategic policy. Building an organization specifically designed to deliver that instrument reliably, repeatedly, and with a consistency that would make every ruler, every vizier, every military commander in the Islamic world understand that they were permanently within reach. The instrument required a very particular kind of human being to wield it, and creating that human being, or more precisely, finding the right raw material and shaping it carefully, was the work that occupied Hassan most deeply in the years after he seized Alamut. Let us talk about the fidai. Not the legend, the reality. The word itself is worth sitting with for a moment. Fidai comes from the Arabic root meaning to sacrifice, to redeem, to give oneself. It carries within it the idea of a willing exchange, your life for something of greater value. In Islamic tradition, the concept had deep roots, connected to the idea of martyrdom, of giving oneself in the way of God. Hassan did not invent this idea, but he took it and refined it into something extraordinarily specific. The fidai were, first and most importantly, believers, not mercenaries. Not men motivated primarily by money or ambition or personal loyalty to Hassan as an individual. They were men who had been brought, gradually and carefully, to a state of genuine theological conviction. The conviction that the Ismaili cause was the cause of truth, that the hidden Imam's eventual return would vindicate everything they suffered, and that death in service of this cause was not merely acceptable, but glorious. Hassan's entire psychological architecture rested on this foundation. Without genuine belief, the system was a house of cards. With it, the system was nearly indestructible, because you cannot bribe or threaten a man who has already decided that death is preferable to betrayal. But belief alone was not enough. The fidai also needed to be capable. And capability, in the context of what they were being asked to do, meant something very specific and very demanding. Consider what a successful assassination in the medieval Islamic world actually required. The target was typically a powerful man, a vizier, a military commander, a caliph, a crusader lord, who was surrounded by bodyguards, who lived in a fortified palace or a heavily guarded camp, who was alert to the possibility of attack by conventional means. The target moved in a world of servants and advisors and petitioners, a world with its own social codes and hierarchies and expectations. To reach that target with a blade meant penetrating that world invisibly, becoming part of it, moving through it without raising suspicion, waiting in some cases for months or years for the precise moment when proximity and vulnerability aligned. This required, above all, patience, a quality that cannot be trained in the ordinary sense. It has to be cultivated from the inside out. A fidai who lost patience, who struck too early or too hastily, compromised not just his own mission, but the entire operation, and potentially the lives of others within the network. Hassan's training therefore placed enormous emphasis on the cultivation of inner stillness, the ability to exist in a state of readiness without tension, to wait without wilting, to maintain the surface appearance of an ordinary man, a servant, a scholar, a merchant, a soldier, while carrying inside a purpose that the surface was specifically designed to conceal. The fidai also needed linguistic and cultural fluency. The assassins operated across a vast and diverse landscape, Persian speaking Persia, Arabic speaking Syria and Iraq, the mixed world of the Crusader states with their French and Latin and local Levantine cultures. A fidai sent to infiltrate a Crusader court needed to be convincing in that context. One sent into the retinue of a Seljuk commander needed to speak the right dialect, wear the right clothes, understand the social codes well enough to navigate without drawing notice. This kind of training took years. It was as much anthropological as physical. A deep immersion in the target culture that produced not just a convincing impersonation, but something closer to a genuine fluency. And then there was the physical training. Not the elaborate martial arts fantasy that later legends attached to the assassins, the idea that they were trained in exotic combat techniques unavailable to their enemies. The reality was simpler and more practical. The fidai needed to be able to get close, strike precisely, and in many cases not survive the attempt. The weapon of choice was almost always a dagger, close quarters, intimate, requiring nerve rather than technique. Many fidai made no attempt to escape after striking. Some appear to have made no attempt at all, accepting death as the natural completion of their act. This was not despair. It was, within the theological framework they inhabited, the final proof of commitment, the martyr's death that completed the sacrifice and guaranteed the spiritual reward. The combination of all these qualities, genuine belief, extraordinary patience, cultural fluency, physical courage, and the willingness to die, made the fidai something genuinely unprecedented in the military history of the medieval world. And Hassan, in his cold mountain fortress, understood that even a small number of men with these qualities was worth more strategically than an army of thousands. The training was embedded in something larger, though. It did not exist in isolation. It was part of a total environment, a community, a way of life, a micro-civilization that Hassan had constructed at Alamut with the same meticulous care he brought to everything. Life at Alamut was austere by the standards of the medieval world, but not brutally so. Hassan himself set the tone. He was, by all accounts, a man of severe personal discipline. He ate simply, slept little, and devoted his days to study, administration, and the elaboration of the theological system he had brought from his years of training and adapted to the specific needs of his movement. He is said to have executed 2 of his own sons during his tenure at Alamut, one for drinking wine, one on a mistaken suspicion of assassination. Whether these stories are literally true or later embellishments is impossible to say with certainty. But they speak to something real about the atmosphere Hassan created, a community in which the rules applied to everyone without exception, including the man at the top, perhaps especially the man at the top. This absolute consistency was itself a form of power. In a medieval world rife with rulers who demanded sacrifice from their followers while exempting themselves from every hardship, Hassan's personal austerity was a theological statement as much as a lifestyle choice. It said, "I am not asking you to live this way because I profit from your sacrifice. I am living this way myself. The cause is the only thing. The cause is everything." The intellectual life of Alamut was genuinely rich. Hassan built a library that contemporaries described as one of the finest in Persia, remarkable in itself given the fortress's remote location and relatively modest size. He collected manuscripts on theology, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. He attracted scholars and thinkers to the mountain, men who came not despite the austerity, but because of it, because there was something in the combination of intellectual seriousness and total commitment that appealed to a certain kind of mind, in the same way that monastic communities appealed to a certain kind of Christian mind in the same era. Hassan himself wrote theological works, though most have been lost, destroyed when the Mongols eventually sacked Alamut's library in 1256, one of history's more irreparable intellectual losses. What survives in quotation and summary suggests a mind of considerable philosophical sophistication, deeply engaged with the Ismaili tradition's esoteric approach to knowledge, and genuinely grappling with the hardest questions of theological epistemology. How do we know what we know? What is the relationship between reason and revelation? What is the nature of the Imam's authority? These were not idle questions for Hassan. They were the foundation on which everything else rested. One doctrine in particular became central to what Hassan taught at Alamut, and it is worth pausing on it, because it illuminates much of what the order did and how it justified doing it. The doctrine was called talim, instruction or authoritative teaching. Hassan's argument, stated simply, was this: human reason alone cannot arrive at religious truth. The interpretation of divine revelation requires authoritative guidance from a divinely appointed teacher, the Imam. Without this guidance, individuals are left to their own fallible reasoning, which produces endless disagreement and no reliable path to truth. The Imam is the solution to the epistemological problem of religion. He is the living key to the inner meaning of Scripture. This sounds, at first, like a fairly conventional argument for religious authority, but Hassan drew from it a conclusion that was considerably more radical. If the Imam is the sole reliable source of religious truth, then the obligation of the believer is not to reason toward truth independently, but to follow the Imam's guidance completely. Not blindly, Hassan was too intellectually serious for that framing, but with a kind of disciplined trust that set aside the endless second-guessing of individual judgment. You did not need to understand every theological nuance. You needed to trust the source. The practical implications of this doctrine for the organization of the assassins were enormous. A community built around Talim was a community built around obedience, not the coerced obedience of a military force, but the chosen obedience of people who had genuinely decided that this was the right epistemic stance. The fidai who followed an order did not need to understand every dimension of the strategic reasoning behind it. He needed to trust that the authority giving the order was legitimate. And the entire apparatus of initiation and graduated revelation was designed to build and reinforce exactly that trust, to bring the initiate slowly, carefully, through layers of teaching until the legitimacy of the authority was not just accepted, but felt in the bones. The castle itself was, over the years of Hassan's tenure, transformed from a military fortification into something more complex. The defences were improved, walls strengthened, water storage expanded, grain reserves maintained at levels that could sustain the garrison through extended siege. But alongside the military infrastructure grew the intellectual and administrative one. Scribes, a postal system for communicating with the growing network of assassin, held fortresses and communities across Persia, a system of coded correspondence that allowed operational communication across enormous distances without compromising security if messages were intercepted. And there were those other fortresses. This is perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of what Hassan built. Alamut was the heart, but it was not the whole body. Over the decades following 1090, the assassins acquired, through the same mixture of missionary work, negotiation, purchase and occasional force, a series of other mountain strongholds scattered across Persia and eventually into Syria. Girdku, Lamassar, Maimundiz, each one chosen with the same eye for defensibility and self-sufficiency that had made Alamut ideal. Each one functioning as a node in the network, a refuge, a base, a centre of training and missionary activity. The network design was strategic genius of a high order. A centralised organisation can be destroyed by destroying its centre. A network cannot. Cut one node and the others continue to function. Destroy Alamut itself and the order would survive in its other fortresses, in its missionary cells embedded in cities across the Islamic world, in the minds of the thousands of initiates who carried its teaching with them wherever they went. Hassan was building something with the structural properties of a living organism, distributed, adaptive, capable of regenerating lost parts. He was also building something with a particular relationship to the concept of territory that was unusual for his time. Medieval power was typically territorial in a very direct sense. You held land, you taxed it, you defended it with soldiers. The size of your territory determined the size of your army, and therefore the extent of your power. Hassan's power did not work this way. The assassins held relatively little territory in the conventional sense. a few mountain valleys, a scattering of fortresses. They were not a state in any normal meaning of the word, but their effective reach extended across the entire Islamic world, because their weapon was not soldiers but the credible threat of targeted violence, and that threat did not diminish with distance. A Seljuk sultan in Isfahan was not safe because he was far from Alamut. A crusader lord in the ports of the Levantine coast was not safe because he was separated from Persia by hundreds of miles of desert and mountain. The geography of conventional military power meant nothing to an organization whose operatives moved as individual human beings through the ordinary social fabric of the world. Hassan had found a way to project force without projecting armies, and in doing so he had created something that the political vocabulary of his era had no word for. Now there is a dimension of what Hassan built that deserves more attention than it usually receives, and that is the relationship between the order's theology and its violence. The assassins have been portrayed, in most of the historical literature that has reached popular audiences, primarily as killers, a death cult, a murder organization, a band of religiously motivated terrorists. This framing is not entirely wrong, but it is significantly incomplete, and the incompleteness distorts the picture in important ways. The assassins did kill people. They killed a great many people over the 2 centuries of the Order's active operation. But killing was a tactic, not a purpose. The purpose was the establishment of Ismaili rule, the protection of the Ismaili community, and the eventual return of the hidden Imam to rightful authority over the Islamic world. Violence was the means to ends that were political and theological, and the specific form of violence the assassins chose, targeted assassination rather than mass violence, reflects a genuine ethical as well as strategic logic. Hassan was not interested in massacring populations. He was not interested in the kind of indiscriminate terror that brutalizes everyone in range. He was interested in removing specific individuals whose removal would alter the political landscape in specific ways. This required identifying the right targets, men whose death would produce the desired political effect, whether that was the destabilization of an enemy government, the prevention of a specific military campaign, the punishment of a particular act of persecution, or the demonstration to a wavering ally that the assassin's protection was real and their vengeance certain. The targeting process was, in other words, a form of strategic analysis. It required understanding the political structure of the target's organization well enough to identify which individual, if removed, would produce the most significant disruption. Nizam al-Mulk had been chosen precisely because he was the administrative spine of the Seljuk state, not the most powerful man in terms of formal rank, but the man whose removal would cause the most structural damage. The calculation proved correct. His death and the Sultan's death within weeks of each other produced exactly the fragmentation Hassan had anticipated. This kind of analysis, treating human organizations as systems whose key nodes could be disrupted by removing specific individuals, was sophisticated political thinking for any era. In the context of the 11th century, when most political violence took the form of armies meeting in open fields, it was revolutionary. Hassan lived at the top of his mountain, and he thought, and he administered, and he prayed, and he taught. He did not give interviews. He did not appear in public. He communicated through intermediaries and letters and the graduated revelations of the Dawah system. To the outside world, to the Seljuk commanders who had failed to dislodge him, to the Sunni religious establishment that declared him a heretic, to the ordinary Muslims who had heard his name spoken in tones of mingled fear and contempt, Hassan-i Sabbah was less a man than a presence, a force that could not be seen, could not be reached, and could apparently reach anyone. This invisibility, was not accidental, it was cultivated. Hassan understood that the less visible he was, the more space the imagination of his enemies would fill with something larger and more frightening than the reality. A man on a mountain, however brilliant, is finite. The thing that a man on a mountain represents in the minds of those who fear him is infinite. Hassan was content to be the symbol. He did not need to be the spectacle. His personal life in these years was stripped to the essential: prayer, study, administration, the occasional meeting with trusted lieutenants. The composition of theological texts, the planning of operations in the wider world. He received reports from his missionary network, issued instructions, approved or rejected proposed actions. The picture that emerges from the fragments of surviving evidence is of a man who had achieved a kind of radical simplification, who had removed from his life everything that was not directly in service of the cause, and found in that removal not deprivation, but clarity. There is something almost monastic about it, and the comparison is not entirely fanciful. Hassan was doing in the mountains of Persia something structurally similar to what the founders of Christian monastic orders were doing in Europe, constructing a total community, a world within a world, organized around a single ultimate purpose, insulated from the compromises and distractions of ordinary life. The theology was entirely different, the political objectives were entirely different, but the organizational logic had the same quality of radical focus, the same understanding that a community committed to a single purpose and willing to order every aspect of life around that purpose could achieve things that ordinary communities could not. By the early 12th century, roughly 2 decades into Hassan's tenure at Alamut, the order had become something that the Seljuk Empire and the broader Islamic world could not ignore and could not quite figure out how to destroy. The fortress network in Persia was established and hardening. The missionary cells in cities across the Islamic world were active and growing. The series of high-profile assassinations had demonstrated, repeatedly, that no level of rank or protection made a target unreachable. And the world beyond Persia was changing in ways that would create new opportunities for the assassins, and new complications. Because in 1096, just 6 years after Hassan seized Alamut, an army of European Christians had arrived on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. Tens of thousands of them, speaking French and Latin and a dozen other languages, armoured in iron and carrying crosses, and motivated by a mixture of genuine religious conviction, land hunger, adventure, and the complicated spiritual economy of papal indulgences. The Crusades had begun. For the Islamic world, the arrival of the Crusaders was a catastrophe and an insult, a military invasion of the heartland of Islamic civilization by forces that most Muslims regarded as barbarians. Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in 1099, and the massacres that accompanied its fall sent a wave of horror and rage across the Islamic world. New political entities, the Crusader states, established themselves along the Levantine coast, creating a permanent European presence in territory that had been Muslim for 4 centuries. For Hassan and the assassins, the Crusader presence was something more complicated. It was, in one sense, simply another set of enemies in an already crowded field. But it was also, potentially, a useful complication in the political landscape. Another factor that occupied the Seljuks' attention. Another source of the kind of fragmentation and competition that the assassins had learned to exploit. And eventually it would be something stranger still, an unlikely source of diplomatic contact, and even, in certain carefully limited circumstances, something approaching mutual accommodation. But that comes later. For now, in the first decades of the 12th century, the assassins were primarily concerned with consolidating what they had built in Persia, and beginning to extend their reach into the rich, complex, conflict-saturated landscape of Syria. because in Syria there was a man who would take what Hassan had built in the mountains of Persia and adapt it to a new environment, a new set of enemies, and a new geopolitical situation with a genius that would eventually earn him the most famous title the assassins ever produced. The Old Man of the Mountain. But before we get to him, we need to understand the full dimensions of what Hassan had made. Not just the organization, not just the doctrine, but the psychological reality of living in a world where the assassins existed. Because that psychological reality, the specific texture of the fear they produced, the way it changed the behavior of kings and commanders and religious leaders across the medieval Islamic world, is in some ways the most important thing Hassan built. More important than the fortresses, more important than the missionary network, more important even than the fidai themselves. Imagine for a moment that you are a Seljuk vizier in the early 12th century. You have bodyguards. You live in a palace with thick walls and locked gates. You do not travel without an armed escort. You have learned, from the deaths of your predecessors, to be careful about who gets close to you, to vary your routines, to be suspicious of new servants and petitioners whose backgrounds cannot be thoroughly verified. And yet you know that Nizam al-Mulk died despite all of this. You know that the men who killed him were not recognizable as killers. They looked like ordinary men, spoke like ordinary men, waited with the patience of men who had nothing but time. You know that the assassins have been operating for 2 decades without a single significant failure that disrupted their capacity. You know that the last 3 people who moved decisively against the order ended up dead before their campaigns concluded. What does this knowledge do to you? It does not paralyze you, necessarily. You continue to function. You continue to administer and advise and make decisions. But somewhere in the background of everything you do, there is a low constant hum of uncertainty that was not there before. A slight heightening of attention when someone new enters a room. A moment of evaluation when a servant brings food that was not prepared in front of you. A recalibration of risks that you used to dismiss without thinking. And here is the thing. The assassins did not need to kill you to benefit from this state. The hum itself was valuable. A ruler distracted by the possibility of assassination is a ruler who makes slightly worse decisions, who is slightly less bold, who is slightly more willing to accommodate the Ismaili communities in his territory, rather than risk the consequences of persecution. The fear was a tax, paid in attention, in caution, in the slight dulling of the aggressive edge that made medieval rulers dangerous. Hassan had created a system that extracted this tax from virtually every significant political actor in the Islamic world. And he did it with a force of a few thousand men in mountain fortresses. The leverage ratio was extraordinary. The investment, training, maintaining, occasionally deploying the fidai, produced returns in political influence and security for the Ismaili community that dwarfed what any conventional military of comparable size could have achieved. The last years of Hassan's life, he died in 1124, having spent 34 years on his mountain without descending, were not quiet ones, but they had a quality of completion about them. The organization he had built was functioning, the network was established, the doctrine was codified. The successors he had chosen, despite the loss of his own sons, were capable men who understood what they had been given and what it required of them. He died as he had lived. On his mountain. In the cold air of the Alborz, having set in motion something that would outlast him by more than a century, that would extend across a geography he had never personally visited, that would produce a literature of fear and legend so durable that we are still telling the story 1,000 years later. His last recorded words, according to sources of uncertain reliability, were addressed to his successor Kia Buzurg Umid, and they were characteristically practical: continue the mission, maintain the fortresses, trust the doctrine, use the blade only when necessary and always with precision. The old man of Alamut was gone, but what he had made remained. And in Syria, a man named Rashid ad-Din Sinan was about to take it somewhere even Hassan had not imagined. The night is deep now, and you are somewhere in it, floating in that pleasant drift between the story and the darkness behind your eyelids. The cold mountains of Persia are somehow both far away and close enough to feel the altitude. You have seen now what Hassan built, and why he built it, and what it cost him to build it. A life given entirely to a purpose. A mountain that became a world. But the assassins were not finished growing. They were about to find a new landscape, new enemies, and a new kind of notoriety that would carry their name across the Mediterranean world and into the imagination of Europe. In the sun-baked mountains of Syria, among the splintered politics of the Crusader states and the rising power of a general named Saladin, the order would reach the full height of its power and begin to earn the legend that still surrounds it. The mountains of Persia had been the cradle. Syria would be the stage. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a court when news arrives of a great man's death. Not the silence of grief, exactly, not yet. Something that comes before grief, a suspended moment in which everyone in the room is simultaneously processing the same impossible information, and none of them have yet decided what it means for them personally. The silence of a world rearranging itself, of futures that were assumed suddenly becoming uncertain, of men who had built their entire careers around proximity to a particular kind of power realizing, in the space of a held breath, that the power they had been orbiting had just gone out. That silence fell over the Seljuk court in the autumn of 1092, when word arrived that Nizam al-Mulk was dead, and then it fell again, weeks later, when the Sultan Malik Shah followed him into the grave. And in the cold mountain fortress of Alamut, far above the valleys where the Seljuk Empire was already beginning to fracture along every fault line that Nizam al-Mulk's competence had been holding closed, Hassan-i Sabbah received the reports from his network and understood that what he had set in motion was working. Not just working better than even his careful calculations had predicted. Because the removal of two men, one vizier and one sultan, had not merely disrupted the Seljuk state. It had begun to dissolve it. The succession crisis that followed Malik Shah's death would keep the Seljuks occupied with their own internal conflicts for decades. The attention and military capacity that might have been turned toward the systematic destruction of the assassin network was instead consumed by brothers fighting brothers, by regional governors declaring independence, by the gradual centrifugal unravelling of an empire that had looked, from the outside, like a monolith. Hassan had not just killed two men, he had changed the shape of the century. But let us not move too quickly past the mechanics of what had happened, because the killing of Nizam al-Mulk was not just strategically significant. It was, in the history of the assassins, the moment of proof. The moment when the theory became practice, when everything Hassan had built and trained and theorized was tested against the hardest possible target and found to work. The fidai who carried out the killing was a man named Bu Tahir Arani. The details of his approach vary between sources, but the broad outline is consistent. He disguised himself as a Sufi mystic, a wandering holy man, a figure whose presence in the retinue of a powerful administrator would not be remarkable. The medieval Islamic world had a deep tradition of itinerant scholars and mystics who moved between courts and patronages, and a man presenting himself in this guise could expect to be received with at least nominal hospitality, even in the household of an enemy. Butahir gained access to Nizam al-Mulk in October 1092 as the vizier was travelling between the cities of Isfahan and Baghdad, carried in a litter as was customary for men of his rank. The moment chosen was the evening, when the day's formal business was concluding and the atmosphere around the vizier would have been slightly more relaxed than during the formal proceedings of the day. Butahir approached. He was close enough to strike. He struck. Nizam al-Mulk died of his wounds that night, reportedly saying as he was carried away that his death had been decreed by God. Whether he knew it was the assassins who had sent the blade, or whether he died believing it was a random act of violence, the sources do not tell us clearly. But the assassins made sure the world knew. The attribution was not accidental. The entire strategic value of the act depended on its being known, on rulers and ministers across the Islamic world understanding that this was not random, that it was deliberate, that it could happen to them. Butahir was killed at the scene, or immediately after. He made no apparent effort to escape. This too was part of the calculation, not a requirement, exactly, but a pattern that the early assassin operations followed with enough consistency to be meaningful. The fidai who did not flee, who accepted death as the natural completion of the act, sent a particular message to the watching world. It said, "These men are not afraid of dying. They cannot be deterred by the threat of death, because death is not, for them, the worst outcome." It said, "The only way to stop this is to prevent it from beginning, because once a fidai has decided to act, his own survival is not a factor in his calculation." For a medieval ruler trying to assess the threat, this was deeply unsettling. Conventional security is built on the assumption that a potential attacker has a survival instinct that can be exploited, that the threat of death or punishment will deter most people most of the time. An attacker who is genuinely resolved to accept death removes the most reliable lever of deterrence available. The mathematics of protection change completely, and the assassins were, with every operation that followed this pattern, systematically demonstrating that this was the kind of organisation they were. The years that followed the killing of Nizam al-Mulk were the years in which the assassins established their rhythm. Not a constant drumbeat of violence that would have been tactically counterproductive, exhausting the organisation's resources and provoking unified responses. Rather a carefully spaced series of strikes, each one chosen for maximum political impact, each one demonstrating a new dimension of the order's reach or capability. The targets in these years form a remarkable list: viziers, military commanders, religious scholars who had issued fatwas calling for the persecution of the Ismaili community, provincial governors who had moved against assassins sympathising populations, a crusader lord or two, when the political logic pointed in that direction. The variety was itself a message. There was no category of enemy that was safe, no position powerful enough to guarantee immunity. The methodology evolved but retained its essential character. Patience, above all. The fidai assigned to a target might spend months building a credible identity in the target's world before any move was made. He might secure a position as a servant, a guard, a merchant with regular access to the target's household. He would observe routines, identify moments of vulnerability, assess the disposition of the guards, and then, when the moment arrived, chosen not in haste, but in the unhurried certainty of a man who had been waiting for exactly this, he would act with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the moment in his mind so many times that the physical reality of it felt almost familiar. The weapon was almost always a dagger, short, concealable, requiring closeness, but that closeness was precisely what the months of patient infiltration had achieved. There was no question of a bow shot from a distance, no attempt at the kind of spectacular public violence that would announce itself from across a room. The assassin's blade worked at the range of an embrace. It required and produced an intimacy with the target that was itself a kind of statement. I was close enough to touch you. I had been close enough for months. You did not know. There were failures. It would be misleading to present the assassins as an organization that never made mistakes, never suffered setbacks, never lost operatives to capture and execution before a mission was completed. The historical record is incomplete enough that we cannot compile a reliable accounting of failed operations. The successes are documented because they happened in public and produced consequences that were recorded. The failures are largely invisible, as failures tend to be when the organizations involved have strong reasons to suppress the record. But we know enough to say that the assassins operated in an environment of genuine danger. Captured operatives were executed, usually publicly, and in ways designed to send a message of their own. The Seljuk authorities, after the killing of Nizam al-Mulk, invested seriously in improving the security around senior officials, larger bodyguard details, more careful vetting of household staff, greater restriction on access to the inner circle. These measures did not stop the assassins. They made the work harder and more expensive, requiring longer preparation and more sophisticated infiltration. But harder and more expensive is not the same as impossible. The more interesting question is what happened when operations succeeded, what the political consequences actually were, because the assassins were not killing for the satisfaction of killing. Each operation was supposed to produce a specific political outcome, a destabilized government, a cancelled military campaign, a message sent to a potential ally about the reliability of assassin support, a demonstration of reach that would encourage accommodation rather than confrontation. Sometimes the outcomes matched the intentions beautifully. The removal of Nizam al-Mulk and Malik Shah had produced exactly the Seljuk fragmentation that Hassan wanted. Other operations achieved their more limited objectives with comparable precision. A planned military campaign against an Ismaili community was called off after the commanding general was killed, the message having been received clearly enough that his successor chose not to continue. But sometimes the consequences were more complicated. The death of a target occasionally produced not the destabilization Hassan intended, but a rallying effect. A successor who came to power with a specific mandate of revenge. A military establishment galvanized by the death of a colleague into the kind of coordinated response that would otherwise have been difficult to organize. The assassins were operating in a complex political environment, and political environments resist even the most sophisticated management. Hassan and his successors were extraordinarily good at reading those environments and choosing their targets with care. They were not infallible. Now let us talk about the geography of fear, because the assassin's power was not distributed evenly across the medieval Islamic world. It was concentrated in certain places, directed towards certain categories of target, and its impact was felt most acutely in the political centres of Seljuk power, in the courts of Persia and Iraq, where the administrators and commanders most directly threatening to the Ismaili community lived and worked. But geography was changing. The Crusader invasion of the Levant had reshuffled the political deck in ways that created both new threats and new opportunities. The Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, were new entities in the region, with their own political dynamics, their own internal conflicts, and their own relationship to the Muslim powers surrounding them. They were also, from the assassin's perspective, a potential market for services. Because here is a thing about the assassins that tends to get lost in the more dramatic accounts of their history, they were not purely ideological actors. They were also, in a very practical sense, a political service. A state or a faction that wanted a specific problem removed had an incentive to seek accommodation with the assassins. and the assassins had an incentive to provide that accommodation when it aligned with their own strategic interests. The order needed income to maintain its fortresses and support its missionaries. It needed political relationships that could provide early warning of threats. It needed the legitimacy that came from being treated as a serious power by other serious powers. The result was that the assassins developed over time a more complex relationship with the political landscape than simple enmity. They had enemies, dedicated, implacable enemies, particularly among the Sunni religious establishment and the Seljuk military. But they also had, at various points, something closer to clients. Rulers and factions who paid for the removal of specific individuals, or who paid simply for the assurance that they themselves would not be targeted. This is uncomfortable territory for those who prefer their historical figures in clear moral categories. The assassins are most easily understood as a resistance movement, a persecuted minority using extreme measures to defend itself and advance its theological vision. That framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Because a resistance movement that sells its services to crusader lords fighting Muslim opponents, or that accepts payment from one Muslim faction to remove another Muslim leader, has moved into a moral universe that is considerably more ambiguous. Hassan himself seems to have been relatively strict about maintaining the order's operations within the bounds of genuine strategic logic, targeting people whose removal served the Ismaili cause or protected the Ismaili community, rather than becoming a simple mercenary service. But the pressure toward commercial accommodation was real, and it grew stronger as the order's expenses grew and as the political landscape created new clients with specific needs. We need to talk about Saladin, or more precisely about the assassins and Saladin, because their relationship is one of the most dramatic and revealing episodes in the order's entire history. Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, is one of the towering figures of the medieval world. Kurdish by ethnicity, trained in the sophisticated military and political culture of the Zengid Sultanate in Syria, he rose to power in Egypt in the 1170s and spent the following 2 decades systematically reunifying the fractured Muslim world of the Levant under his authority. He was a brilliant military commander, a sophisticated politician, a man of genuine personal piety, and, this is relevant, a dedicated Sunni who regarded the Ismaili Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt as an illegitimate heresy and moved deliberately to extinguish it. When Saladin abolished the Fatimid Caliphate in 1171, replacing it with Sunni religious authority, he was not merely making a theological statement. He was destroying the last significant Ismaili political power in the Arab world, the institution that had, however imperfectly, provided the Ismaili movement with a degree of protection and legitimacy since the 10th century. For the assassins, who had always maintained a complicated and sometimes tense relationship with the Fatimids, but who nonetheless existed within the broader Ismaili world that the Fatimid Caliphate anchored, this was an act of profound hostility. And then Saladin turned his attention northward, towards Syria, with the Syrian branch of the assassins, under the leadership of Rashid ad-Din Sinan. The legendary old man of the mountain had established themselves in the mountain fortresses of the Jabal Bara, and the assassins decided that Saladin needed to die. The first attempt came in 1174 or 1175, when Saladin was besieging the town of Arzaz in northern Syria. A group of fidai attacked him in his camp. He survived, reportedly because his armour deflected the blades, a piece of luck that even Saladin's admirers acknowledged was remarkable, given how well the assassins generally planned their operations. The second attempt came in 1176, when fidai disguised as soldiers in his own army attacked him during his camp routine. He survived again, this time because one of his emirs threw himself in the way of a blade intended for Saladin, 2 failed attempts. This was unusual. The assassins did not often fail twice against the same target, and the implications of repeated failure were significant, not just tactically, but psychologically, because part of the assassin's power lay in the perception of their near infallibility. A target who survived once might be considered lucky. A target who survived twice began to suggest that the aura of inevitability surrounding the order was not quite as absolute as it appeared. Saladin responded to the second attempt with a military campaign against the Syrian assassins, marching on their fortress of Masyaf in the summer of 1176 and laying siege to it. And then something happened that has been the subject of historical fascination and dispute ever since. The siege was lifted. Saladin withdrew, and he and Sinan, the old man of the mountain, appear to have reached some kind of accommodation that was never fully explained and is still not entirely understood. The legends that grew up around this moment are extraordinary. One version holds that Saladin awoke one morning in his camp to find, beside his sleeping head, a hot cake of the kind baked by the assassins, and a note indicating that the assassins could reach him whenever they chose. Another version involves a poisoned dagger and a message. The details vary wildly between sources, but they share a common structure. Saladin, the great conqueror, was made to understand that his life existed at the assassin's discretion, and this understanding produced the accommodation. Whether any of these specific stories are true is impossible to say with confidence. What is documented is that after 1176, Saladin and the Syrian assassins coexisted without further direct conflict for the remainder of both their active careers. Saladin went on to reconquer Jerusalem in 1187 and spend his remaining years fighting the Crusaders. The assassins continued to operate in Syria. Their fundamental enmity, rooted in the theological gulf between Sunni and Ismaili Islam, never dissolved. But the active hostility ceased, replaced by something like a wary mutual recognition of boundaries. This episode illuminates something important about the assassin's power at its height. Even Saladin, arguably the most capable military leader of the 12th century, a man who defeated the Crusaders at the height of their power and unified the Muslim world of the Levant, could not simply destroy the Syrian assassins by force. The mountain fortresses were too strong, the network too distributed. The cost of a sustained campaign to eliminate them utterly was too high, and the benefit uncertain. Better, perhaps, to find an accommodation, to establish limits, to recognize each other as factors in the landscape that had to be accounted for. This was not victory for the assassins. It was not defeat for Saladin. It was something more interesting, a recognition by one of history's great conventional military powers that there was a category of adversary that conventional military power could not simply overwhelm. The targets of the blade, across the full span of the order's active period in both Persia and Syria, represent a remarkable cross-section of medieval political life. Let us walk through some of the most significant, because the pattern of targeting reveals the order's strategic logic more clearly than any theoretical description. Nizam al-Mulk, 1092, the administrative backbone of the Seljuk Empire. Removed at the moment most calculated to maximize the subsequent political fragmentation. The Caliph al-Mustashid, 1135, the Abbasid Caliph himself, the nominal spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, was killed by assassin operatives after he moved militarily against Ismaili communities. The killing of a caliph was a statement of breathtaking audacity, a demonstration that the order placed its theological and political objectives above any conventional hierarchy of the sacred. Conrad of Montferrat, 1192, the newly elected King of Jerusalem, killed just days after his election by two fidai who had spent months insinuating themselves into his world disguised as Christian monks. This operation is one of the most discussed in the assassin's history, partly because of the circumstances. Conrad was killed at what should have been a moment of triumph, and partly because of the murky politics surrounding it. Multiple parties had reasons to want Conrad dead, and the question of who ultimately commissioned the killing has been disputed by historians for 8 centuries. The vizier of the Abbasid Caliph, multiple instances across the 12th century. The assassins returned repeatedly to the administrative leadership of the Abbasid state, targeting the men who translated the caliph's nominal authority into actual policy, particularly when that policy moved against Ismaili interests. Raymond II of Tripoli, 1152, one of the early Crusader lords to fall to assassin blades, killed near Tripoli in circumstances that have never been entirely explained. His death contributed to the political complications of the Crusader states and may have served the interests of multiple parties simultaneously. What these targets share is not a simple common characteristic. They are not all enemies of the same faction, not all members of the same religion, not all located in the same geography. What they share is that each of them, at the moment of their death, represented a specific obstacle to Ismaili interests, or a specific threat to Ismaili communities, and their removal was calculated to produce a specific political consequence. The logic was strategic throughout. The violence was, in the most precise sense of the word, purposeful. The psychological dimension of the assassin's power reached its most refined expression during this period, the high noon of the order's effectiveness, roughly the century from the 1090s to the 1190s. And it is worth trying to inhabit that psychological dimension from the inside, from the perspective of the men who lived under the shadow of the blade. Consider a senior Seljuk official in the mid-12th century. He is probably aware, at least in outline, of what the assassins are and how they operate. He knows about the killings that have preceded his own tenure. He has almost certainly taken precautions, vetted his household staff more carefully than his predecessors, varied his public routines, limited access to his private quarters. He carries, probably without being conscious of carrying it, a low-level alertness that was not part of how his father had moved through the world. But here is the thing about sustained low-level alertness. It is exhausting in ways that acute fear is not. Acute fear has a beginning and an end, the threat arrives, the body responds, the threat passes or doesn't. Low-level sustained alertness has no end. It runs in the background of every interaction, colours every new relationship, makes the ordinary texture of political life, the meetings, the meals, the ceremonies, the casual conversations with subordinates, slightly less ordinary than it should be. Every new servant is a potential fidai. Every petitioner who requests a private audience carries the possibility of a blade. The assassins did not need to kill this official to change the quality of his life. They had already changed it, simply by existing. And this psychological tax extended beyond the individual. Courts and governments that lived under the assassin threat were courts that functioned slightly differently from those that did not. Decision-making processes that should have been straightforward were complicated by the question of who was safe to include in which discussions. Information that should have flowed freely through an administrative hierarchy was hoarded, because a man who had been recruited by the assassin's missionary network was not necessarily identifiable by anything visible. The paranoia was not irrational. It was an entirely reasonable response to a real and demonstrated threat. But rational paranoia is still paranoia, and it still corrodes the institutions it inhabits. There is a moment in the history of the Order's Syrian operations that captures the full dimensions of assassin power more vividly than almost any other. It involves not a killing, but a demonstration. a performance almost, staged with the precision of theatre and the coldness of a military exercise. The story, and it has the quality of a story that has been polished by retelling, though it has enough specificity and enough corroborating detail to carry some weight, involves Sinan and a delegation from one of the Crusader lords. The Crusader, negotiating some point of politics or mutual interest with the Syrian assassins, was apparently sceptical about the depth of the fidai's commitment. He wanted proof of the absolute obedience that Sinan commanded. Sinan is said to have gestured to a guard standing on the parapet of the fortress above them, and with a slight inclination of his head, indicated to the guard what was required. The guard stepped off the parapet without hesitation, fell to his death without a sound. Sinan turned back to the Crusader ambassador and gestured to another guard. The same thing, and then asked, calmly, whether proof was sufficient. The story may be embellished, the details may be wrong, but the kernel of it, the demonstration of absolute command, the willingness to sacrifice a follower as a display of power rather than in service of a specific operation, is consistent with everything we know about how the Syrian assassins operated and how they chose to present themselves to the outside world. Whether or not it happened exactly this way, it is the kind of thing that could have happened. And the fact that people believed it could have happened, that the story circulated and was credited, tells us everything we need to know about the reputation the assassins had built. By the end of the 12th century, the assassins had achieved something extraordinary. They had operated for over a century. They had survived repeated military campaigns by the most powerful states in the region. They had killed caliphs and viziers and military commanders and kings. They had established a network of fortresses that could not be reduced by conventional siege. They had cultivated a reputation that made their name, in the political vocabulary of the medieval world, a category unto itself. And they had done all of this with an organisation that, at its absolute maximum extent, probably numbered in the low thousands of fully initiated members. The fidai, the actual operatives, were a small fraction of that number, perhaps hundreds, perhaps a few dozen at any given moment, who were actively deployed. The leverage they achieved from this tiny force against the largest empires of their age remains one of the most remarkable asymmetric achievements in the history of organised violence. But power that rests on reputation is fragile in a specific way. A military force can be rebuilt after defeat. You recruit more soldiers, forge more weapons, train new commanders. A reputation is harder to rebuild once damaged. The assassins' power depended on the perception of their reach and their reliability, and that perception, in the early 13th century, was about to face its hardest test. Because from the east, moving with a speed and a destructive power that nothing in the medieval world had previously encountered, something was coming that would prove immune to the psychological weapons the assassins had spent a century perfecting. Something that could not be deterred by reputation, could not be paralysed by uncertainty, could not be made to feel the low constant hum of existential anxiety that the blade in the dark produced in ordinary men. The Mongols did not fear the assassins, and in the world the assassins had built, that absence of fear was the most dangerous thing imaginable. But before the storm arrived from the east, the Syrian branch of the order had decades yet to operate. Decades in which the complicated, surprising, sometimes almost collegial relationship between the assassins and the Crusader states would develop into one of the strangest diplomatic arrangements of the medieval world. Decades in which the old man of the mountain would build something in Syria that rivaled, and in certain ways surpassed, what Hassan had built in Persia. Decades in which the word assassin would cross the Mediterranean on the lips of returning crusaders and plant itself in the European imagination with a tenacity that 8 centuries have not loosened. The Syrian chapter was not a footnote. It was, in many ways, the part of the story that the world remembered longest. The night has deepened around you now, settled into that particular stillness that belongs to the small hours, the time when the world outside has gone as quiet as it gets, and your own thoughts have begun to slow and soften. The story of the blade is told, at least in its broad strokes. The targets chosen with such cold precision, the fidai who waited months for their moment, and then moved with the certainty of men who had already made their peace. The fear spreading outward from each killing like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, changing the behaviour of courts and commanders across the whole width of the medieval Islamic world. This was the age of the blade. It had its own terrible logic, its own dark coherence, but the assassins were never simply killers, and the Syrian chapter, the chapter of the old man of the mountain, of Saladin's uneasy accommodation, of the Crusader connections and the diplomatic chess played across the fault lines of the medieval Levant, was about to reveal dimensions of the order that the blade alone could never have produced. A movement that only kills is a movement with a limited vocabulary. The assassins, at their most sophisticated, were speaking in something considerably richer than that. There is a particular quality of light in the mountains of coastal Syria that travellers have been remarking upon for centuries. It comes in the late afternoon, when the sun has dropped low enough to stop burning and begins instead to illuminate, to find the angles in the limestone ridges, to fill the valleys between them with a golden shadow that is neither quite light nor quite dark, but something in between. The mountains of the Jabal Bahra, rising from the coastal plain of what is now northwestern Syria, catch this light in ways that make them seem less like a landscape and more like something arranged, something placed there with intention. The villages on their slopes are pale against the stone, the old fortresses on their highest points, and there are several, because this was always a landscape made for fortification, seem to grow from the rock rather than sit on it, as though the mountain itself had slowly pushed them upward over centuries until they broke the surface. It was into this landscape that the Syrian branch of the assassins came in the early 12th century, and it was from these mountains, different in character from the cold heights of the Alborz, warmer, greener, closer to the sea and the complicated politics of the Levantine coast, that the order would launch the operations that made their name permanent in the vocabulary of the Western world. But before we get to the man who made all of that possible, we need to understand how the Syrian assassins came to be here at all. Because the Syrian branch did not emerge fully formed. It was planted, carefully and at some cost, from Persia. And the story of that planting tells us something important about how the order thought about geography and opportunity. The Ismaili community had existed in Syria long before Hassan-i Sabbah seized Alamut. The region had been under Fatimid influence for much of the 10th and 11th centuries, and the Ismaili missionary network had established roots in Syrian cities, Aleppo, Damascus, and the smaller towns of the interior that predated the organised assassin movement. When Hassan began extending his operations westward from Persia, he was not building in an empty landscape. He was building on a foundation that already existed, activating a network that was already there, and channeling the loyalty of communities that already had reasons to be receptive. The early history of the Syrian assassins is complicated and not entirely clear in the sources. There were several attempts to establish a base in the region in the first decades of the 12th century, and several of these attempts ended badly. Operatives captured and killed, communities exposed and persecuted, provisional strongholds taken back by hostile forces. The urban environments of Aleppo and Damascus proved too exposed, too easily penetrated by Seljuk and later Zengid authority to serve as reliable bases. What the Syrian assassins needed, and what took them several decades and considerable loss to acquire, was what their Persian counterparts already had. Mountains. The Jabal Bahra provided those mountains. A range of modest but defensible hills running roughly parallel to the Syrian coastline, separated from the sea by the coastal plain and from the interior by the valley of the Orontes River. Not as dramatic as the Alborz, not as high or as cold or as remote, but possessed of the same essential quality that Hassan had recognized in Alamut, a combination of natural defensibility and agricultural sufficiency that made a self-contained community possible. The assassins began acquiring fortresses in the Jabal Bahra in the 1130s and 1140s through the same mixture of purchase, negotiation, and careful infiltration that had served them in Persia. The most important of these was a fortress called Masyaf, a solid, well-positioned stronghold on a rocky prominence above a fertile valley that would become the Syrian order's equivalent of Alamut, not quite as remote, not quite as impregnable, but substantial enough to serve as a headquarters and defensible enough to have resisted, as we have already seen, even Saladin's determined siege. Around Masyaf clustered a network of smaller fortresses, Kaf, Kawabi, Rusafa, Kuleya, Uleka, each one chosen for its contribution to the overall defensive geometry of the assassin territory. They were not contiguous. Between them lay valleys and passes controlled by other powers, Crusader lords, local Muslim rulers, Byzantine-influenced communities. The assassin presence in the Jabal Bahra was more of an archipelago than a territory, islands of control in a sea of competing influences. This made the overall position more complex to manage than the Persian network, but also, in certain ways, more flexible, a distributed presence that could orient itself toward different power centres as circumstances changed. And the circumstances in Syria were changing constantly. Because the Syrian assassins had arrived in one of the most politically complicated landscapes on earth, to understand what the Syrian assassins were navigating, you need to hold in your mind simultaneously the following: the Crusader states strung along the Levantine coast, internally divided and perpetually anxious about their survival. The Zengid dynasty controlling Aleppo and Mosul, aggressively Sunni and deeply hostile to both Crusaders and Ismailists. The declining remnants of Fatimid authority in Egypt, the local Syrian Muslim rulers of various smaller principalities, many of them more interested in surviving the immediate pressures than in pursuing any ideological program, Byzantine power flickering on the northern horizon, and the constant movement of peoples, armies, traders, pilgrims and diplomats through a landscape where three of the world's great religions had their holiest sites, and every power in the region had claims that overlapped with every other power's claims. Into this landscape the Syrian assassins inserted themselves with remarkable political dexterity. They were too small to be a conventional military force. They were too theologically distinct to be absorbed into any of the major power blocks. But they were precisely positioned, geographically, demographically, and organisationally, to make themselves useful, dangerous, or both, to virtually every actor in the region. And they used that position with a sophistication that their Persian counterparts, operating in a somewhat simpler political environment, had not needed to develop to the same degree. The man who developed it was the figure history knows as Rashid ad-Din Sinan, and Sinan was, in almost every respect, a fascinating and slightly different kind of leader from Hassan-i Sabbah. Sinan was born in Basra, in what is now southern Iraq, probably around 1130. He was educated at Alamut, sent there as a young man, as was customary for the order's most promising recruits, to receive training directly in the Persian heartland of the movement. He spent years at Alamut absorbing theology, strategy, and the full apparatus of the Dawah system. He was brilliant, politically astute, and possessed of a personal charisma that Hassan, by most accounts, had deliberately suppressed in himself, the charisma of a man who could enter a room and make everyone in it aware of his presence. He was sent to Syria sometime in the 1160s, initially as an agent of the Persian leadership, and he spent the following decades building the Syrian branch into something that, while retaining its connection to Alamut, developed an increasingly distinct character shaped by its very different environment. Where Hassan had been an ascetic theologian on a remote mountain, Sinan was a political operator in a crowded landscape. A man who needed to maintain relationships with a dozen different power centres simultaneously, while never losing sight of the order's fundamental theological and strategic objectives. The title he acquired, Sheikh al-Jabal, the Old Man of the Mountain, was not a description of his age, at least not initially. It was a translation of his title and status into the vocabulary of the Crusader lords who encountered him, and it captured something real about his relationship to the landscape. He was the mountain, not just the man who lived on it. The presence that the mountain represented in the political consciousness of everyone around it. The Crusaders' encounter with Sinan and the Syrian assassins is one of the great cross-cultural political stories of the medieval world, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives in histories that focus either on the Crusades or on the assassins, but rarely on the space between them. The Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa were, by the middle of the 12th century, approximately 3 generations old. Their founders, the men and women who had come east on the First Crusade and established European Christian rule over territories that had been Muslim for 4 centuries, were long dead. Their grandchildren were running these states now, and those grandchildren were in many ways a different kind of people from their ancestors. They had been born in the Levant, or had come there young enough to grow up in it. They spoke Arabic alongside their French and Latin. They had Syrian Christian neighbours, Jewish neighbours, Muslim neighbours with whom daily practical life required accommodation. They had adopted local food, local architecture, local medical practices. They wore lighter clothes than their European cousins, and had opinions about which Syrian wines were worth drinking. They were, in other words, a product of the landscape they inhabited, more hybrid, more pragmatic, more comfortable with complexity than the ideologically pure crusader of European imagination. This pragmatism extended to their political relationships. The Crusader lords had learned from hard experience that the ideological clarity of the original crusade, Christianity against Islam, European civilization against the Eastern world, did not map cleanly onto the political realities of the Levant. Muslim powers fought each other as readily as they fought Crusaders. Some Muslim rulers were more reliably hostile to the Crusader states than others. Some were more useful as trading partners or tactical allies than as enemies. The binary of crusade and jihad was real and important, but it was not the only framework within which political decisions could be made. The Syrian assassins occupied an interesting position in this more pragmatic landscape. They were Muslim, but of a sect that the mainstream Sunni powers regarded as heretical. They were enemies of the Zengids and later the Ayyubids, the very dynasties that posed the most serious military threat to the Crusader state's survival. They controlled territory in the Jabal Bara that sat between the Crusader county of Tripoli and the Muslim interior, a buffer zone that neither the Crusaders nor the Muslims could afford to ignore. The relationship that developed between the Syrian assassins and the Crusader states was not friendship. It was not alliance in any formal sense. It was something more pragmatic and more interesting, a mutual recognition that each party had things the other needed, and that an arrangement of coexistence punctuated by occasional cooperation and occasional conflict was more beneficial to both than straightforward enmity. The financial dimension of this relationship is particularly revealing and particularly underappreciated. The Syrian assassins, unlike their Persian counterparts who had the relatively self-sufficient valley of Alamut to sustain them, needed income from outside their own territory. The Jabal Bahra was fertile enough to feed the communities living in it, but not wealthy enough to fund the administration, the military preparation, and the missionary activities that the order required. The assassins needed revenue, and in the complicated political economy of the 12th century Levant, one of the most reliable sources of that revenue was the Crusader county of Tripoli. The arrangement that developed, and it is documented in the historical record clearly enough to be treated as established fact rather than speculation, involved the Syrian assassins paying a form of tribute to the Knights Hospitaller, who controlled significant territory adjacent to the Assassin Mountain strongholds. This tribute was not extortion in the simple sense. It was more like a fee for a relationship, an acknowledgement by the assassins that their position in the landscape was partly dependent on Crusader acquiescence, and an acknowledgement by the Crusaders that the assassins' continued existence in the Jabal Bahra was on balance more useful than their destruction. The Hospitallers received the tribute. In return they provided a degree of protection, or more precisely, a degree of non-interference that allowed the assassin communities to function without the constant threat of Crusader military pressure from the West. The arrangement did not prevent violence between the parties. There were episodes of conflict, moments when the relationship broke down and had to be rebuilt, but the basic structure held for decades, a testament to the pragmatism of both parties. And there were operations, not formally contracted, not openly acknowledged, but sufficiently documented in the historical record to be taken seriously. Crusader lords who had specific enemies, Muslim commanders threatening specific Crusader positions, political rivals within the Crusader states, whose removal would simplify a succession problem, had means of communicating that need to the Syrian assassins. The assassins had means of evaluating whether a proposed operation aligned with their own interests well enough to justify the expenditure of resources. When the interests aligned, things happened. The killing of Conrad of Montferrat in 1192 is the most famous and most disputed example. Conrad had just been elected King of Jerusalem, a position that represented an enormous political victory for one faction of the Crusader aristocracy and a corresponding defeat for another. He was killed within days of his election by two fidai, who by all accounts had spent considerable time building their cover identities in the region before striking. Multiple parties had reasons to want Conrad dead. Richard I of England, who had supported a rival claimant to the Jerusalem throne, was accused by some contemporaries. Saladin's remaining forces were accused by others. The assassins claimed responsibility, or at least the old man of the mountain made statements afterward that acknowledged the killing, but whether they acted independently or at someone's request, and if the latter at whose request, has never been definitively established. The ambiguity is itself illuminating. By 1192, the Syrian assassins had built a reputation sufficiently complex and their political relationships sufficiently multi-directional that attributing their actions cleanly to any single motivation or patron was genuinely difficult. They had become a factor in the political landscape that everyone had to account for, but nobody could fully read. Which was, of course, precisely what they wanted. Let us spend some time with Sinan himself. Because Sinan was not merely an organisational administrator or a political operator, though he was both of those things with extraordinary skill. He was also a theological innovator, a figure whose approach to the Ismaili tradition he had inherited from Hassan pushed it in directions that the Persian leadership found, at various points, distinctly uncomfortable. Sinan's theological adventurousness showed itself most dramatically in the period around 1164, when the Persian Grand Master Hassan II declared the Qiyamah, the resurrection. This was an extraordinary theological moment, an announcement that the hidden Imam had returned to the world in a spiritual sense, that the age of religious law was over, that the inner meaning of Islam had superseded the outer forms. The Qiyamah was effectively a proclamation of antinomianism, the suspension of the Sharia, the Islamic legal framework that governed daily behaviour. It meant, in principle, that the community could set aside the outer observances of Islamic practice in favour of the inner spiritual reality that the Imam embodied. The Persian assassin community celebrated the Qiyamah. They feasted publicly in Ramadan, they drank wine, they performed the prayers facing the Imam rather than Mecca. It was a moment of theological liberation, at least for those within the order who had been waiting for exactly this declaration. Sinan's response in Syria was more complicated. He implemented the Qiyamah, as was his obligation as a leader of the order. But he did so with modifications, with hedging, with a sensitivity to the Syrian context that the Persian leadership found inadequate. The Syrian communities lived in closer proximity to Sunni Muslim neighbours than the Persian ones. They depended on relationships with those neighbours for their safety and their commerce. A complete public abandonment of Islamic observance risked those relationships in ways that the Persian communities, more isolated in their mountains, could absorb more easily. This sensitivity produced tension. There is evidence of correspondence between Sinan and the Persian leadership in which the Grand Masters attempted to assert their authority over the Syrian branch, and Sinan resisted, not openly defying the central authority, but finding ways to implement directives on his own terms, in his own timing, with his own modifications. He was too valuable, and the Syrian operation too important, for the Persian leadership to simply replace him. But the tension was real. What this tension reveals is that the order was not, even at its height, a perfectly unified monolith. It was an organisation with a strong central doctrine and a strong founding vision that nevertheless had to accommodate the realities of operating across very different political and social environments. The Syrian context required different things from the Persian context. Sinan understood this. The Persian leadership understood it in theory, but found it frustrating in practice. The accommodation they reached was never fully comfortable. The later period of Sinan's leadership also saw him develop an aura of personal holiness and even supernatural authority that went beyond anything Hassan had claimed for himself. Stories circulated, and were encouraged to circulate, about Sinan's miraculous powers. His ability to appear in two places simultaneously, his knowledge of things he could not have known through ordinary means, his immunity to physical harm. Whether Sinan himself believed these stories, or whether he cultivated them as pure political theatre, is impossible to say. Probably both. The line between genuine spiritual conviction and deliberate myth-making is rarely clear in charismatic religious leaders of any tradition, and Sinan was operating in a world where supernatural authority was a legitimate and important form of political capital. The effect, in any case, was to make Sinan himself a figure of a different order from the leaders around him, not just a political operator or a military commander. Something more elemental, a presence. The mountain made flesh and given voice. The geographic position of the Syrian assassins created opportunities that Sinan exploited with considerable creativity. Sitting between the Crusader states to the west and the Muslim powers to the east and south, the Syrian branch had diplomatic options that no purely Muslim or purely Christian actor in the region possessed. They could speak to both worlds. They could play each against the other. They could position themselves as potential allies, as neutral parties in specific disputes, as channels of communication between powers that could not speak to each other directly. There is a fascinating episode, probably from the 1170s, that illustrates this diplomatic creativity at its most striking. According to several sources, including the important account of the Crusader historian William of Tyre, Sinan sent an embassy to the Kingdom of Jerusalem exploring the possibility of a formal alliance, and specifically, according to William's account, the possibility that the Syrian assassins might collectively convert to Christianity if certain conditions were met. The conditions allegedly demanded by Sinan included the remission of the tribute that the assassins were paying to the Knights Templar, a different parallel arrangement from the hospitaller relationship, and some form of formal recognition of the assassin community's status and safety. The embassy reached Jerusalem and was initially received with some interest. The prospect of bringing a significant Muslim community over to Christianity, even in the pragmatic, politically negotiated sense that this conversion would have represented, was appealing to certain factions in the Crusader court. The theological purity of such a conversion was not really the point. The political stabilisation of the assassin relationship was. The embassy failed. The accounts are not entirely clear on why, but the most credible explanation is that the Knights Templar, who stood to lose a significant revenue stream if the tribute arrangement was cancelled, intervened to ensure that the negotiation did not succeed. The Templar representatives reportedly ambushed and killed the returning assassin ambassadors, provoking a furious response from Sinan and permanently closing that particular avenue of diplomacy. Whether the conversion offer was genuinely sincere, whether Sinan actually contemplated leading his community into Christianity, is almost certainly not the right question. The offer was almost certainly a piece of sophisticated political theatre, a way of testing the Crusader court's divisions and opening space for a renegotiated relationship. That it failed the way it did tells us something about the limits of Crusader political cohesion. The Templars' interests and the Kingdom of Jerusalem's interests were not always the same interests. Sinan was probing that gap, and he found it. The relationship between the assassins and the Crusader states also operated at a more personal and intimate level that tends to get lost in the large-scale strategic analysis. Individuals on both sides knew each other. Messengers passed regularly between the mountain fortresses and the Crusader castles. There was trade, goods moved through the territory that the assassins controlled, and the Order took its customs revenues from that trade as any territorial power would. There were languages shared. Arabic was the common diplomatic tongue of the Levant, and educated Crusader lords who had grown up in the region spoke it as readily as they spoke French. In this more intimate landscape, the assassins were not an abstraction. They were neighbours. Neighbours with a specific and frightening reputation, neighbours whose goodwill was worth maintaining and whose enmity was worth avoiding. But neighbours in the basic human sense, people you might encounter in a marketplace, whose messengers you might receive in your hall, whose leaders you might sit across a table from and negotiate with, person to person, in the complicated and pragmatic way that medieval political life required. The image of the assassins that European crusaders carried home, the exotic, drug-addled fanatics of Marco Polo's account, the mysterious figures of the Arabic tales, was shaped partly by genuine encounter and partly by the distance at which most Europeans who had never been to the Levant received those encounters. The men who had actually dealt with Sinan knew something more complex. They knew a political intelligence of a high order, an organisation with its own logic and its own objectives, a leadership that could be negotiated with even when it could not be trusted. Sinan died around 1193, roughly a year after the killing of Conrad of Montferrat. He had led the Syrian assassins for approximately 25 years, from the 1160s through to his death, and in those years he had transformed the Syrian branch from a relatively marginal outpost of the Persian movement into an independent political power of real significance. He had survived Saladin. He had maintained the Order's coherence through the theological turmoil of the Qiyamah period. He had built a relationship with the Crusader states that provided the Syrian assassins with a degree of security they could not have achieved through military means alone. He had created the legend of the Old Man of the Mountain, a legend so durable and so vivid that it would cross the Mediterranean, enter European literature and imagination, and provide the distorted template through which the Western world would understand the assassins for centuries. His successors in Syria continued to operate the order with competence, if not with his particular genius. The late 12th and early 13th centuries saw the Syrian branch maintain its position, the fortress network intact, the diplomatic relationships managed, the operational capacity for targeted violence preserved. The tribute arrangements continued, the operations continued. The world of the Jabal Bahra continued its careful navigation of the overlapping pressures from east and west. But in Persia, something had changed. The Order's Persian heartland, the network of mountain fortresses anchored at Alamut, was facing a new kind of pressure. Not the familiar pressure of Seljuk military campaigns or Abbasid ideological hostility. Something different. Something that the Order's entire strategic architecture had been designed to resist but had never actually encountered. The Mongols had arrived in the Middle East. And the Mongols, as the world was rapidly discovering, were not like anything that had come before. The Mongol advance across the Islamic world in the first half of the 13th century is one of the most catastrophic events in the history of human civilization, and it bears briefly on the assassin's story even before the final confrontation. Because the Mongol advance created a new kind of geopolitical pressure across the entire region, collapsing the Seljuk successor states, destabilizing the Abbasid Caliphate, pushing refugee populations westward, creating a wave of political disruption that reached even the relatively isolated world of the Jabal Bahra. The assassins' response to the early stages of the Mongol advance was characteristically complex. There were attempts at diplomacy. The Order sent envoys to the Mongol court, as did virtually every political entity in the region that was trying to assess the new power and find some accommodation with it. There were attempts to exploit the disruption the Mongols created, opportunities for the Order to expand into territories vacated by collapsing Seljuk power. There was a period in which the Persian leadership apparently believed that the Mongols could be managed, that the Order's traditional methods, the cultivated threat, the targeted removal of key figures, the diplomatic offering of neutrality or alliance, would work on these newcomers as they had worked on every previous power the assassins had encountered. They were wrong, and the reasons they were wrong are worth understanding, because they illuminate something important about both the assassins and the Mongols. The Mongols' relationship to the psychological weapons the assassins had spent a century perfecting was simply different from that of any previous adversary. The Mongol political culture did not place the same value on the lives of individual commanders that the medieval Islamic and Crusader political cultures did. A Seljuk vizier or a Crusader lord was a unique and not easily replaceable individual whose death would produce a specific political consequence. A Mongol commander, operating within a military system designed for rapid adaptation and delegation, was more replaceable. More critically, the Mongol leadership had a different relationship to fear itself, not the absence of it, but a cultural framework in which the appropriate response to a threat was total, overwhelming, eliminatory violence rather than accommodation or deterrence. You did not negotiate with the Mongols from a position of threat. You submitted or you were destroyed. And the Mongols, unlike every previous enemy the assassins had faced, had both the will and the capacity to do exactly that. To bring not an army that could be worn down by the Order's mountain defences and psychological arsenal, but a force so overwhelming, so patient in its siegecraft, so indifferent to the cost, that the traditional assassin advantages simply did not apply. The Grand Master of the Persian Order in the 1250s a man named Rukn-ad-Din Kursha, seems to have understood this earlier than some of his subordinates. He was not, by most accounts, a man of Hassan's calibre, not a military genius or a theological visionary. He was an administrator in an impossible situation, facing a threat that his organisation had not been designed to meet, trying to find a path through a landscape that had no good exits. He tried diplomacy. He tried submission. He tried negotiation. He sent his son to the Mongol court as a gesture of submission, a traditional signal of willingness to accommodate. The Mongol commander, Hulagu Khan, received these gestures with the patience of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was simply waiting for the logistically optimal moment to do it. In 1256, the Mongol armies arrived beneath the walls of Alamut. The night is very deep now. Somewhere beyond your window, the world is doing its quiet, unobserved business, the slow work of hours passing, of stars moving overhead in their ancient arcs, of the dark before morning settling into its own particular kind of stillness. You have travelled a long way tonight, from the mountains of Persia to the sun-warmed hills of Syria, from the cold austerity of Alamut to the complicated warmth of the Jabal Bahra, where an organisation born in theological crisis learned to navigate the most politically complex landscape on earth with a sophistication that still commands a grudging admiration across 8 centuries of distance. Sinan is gone. The Crusader states are entering their final, increasingly desperate decades. The world the assassins had built their power within, the fractured, competing, mutually checking world of Seljuk and Crusader and Fatimid and Zengid, is being swept away by a force from the east that does not play by any of the rules that world had established. The final chapter of the assassins as a military and political power is a chapter of storm, of a fortress falling that was supposed to be impregnable, of a network scattered to the winds and then, slowly, incompletely, reassembling itself in forms nobody had predicted, and of a word, assassin, crossing the sea, entering the mouths of European travellers, shedding its specific history like a skin, and becoming something new and strange and permanent in the languages of the world. The storm is almost here. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows the end of something that has existed for a very long time. Not the silence of a single death, which has its own texture, sudden, localized, contained within the boundaries of one life ending. This is a different kind of silence. The silence that settles over a place when the thing that gave it meaning has gone. When the walls are still standing, but the purpose that animated them has been removed, the way a body continues to hold its shape for a time after the life has left it. The valley of Alamut still exists. The rock is still there. The traces of the castle are still there, if you know where to look, if you are willing to make the climb. But the thing that made Alamut Alamut, the presence, the purpose, the emanation of intentional human will that had made a cold mountain into the centre of a world, that is gone. It went in 1256. And the way it went, and what happened after, and what the long shadow of the assassins cast across the centuries that followed, that is what we have left to tell tonight. To understand what the fall of Alamut actually meant, you need to understand what it did not mean. Because the story of the assassins does not end in 1256. It changes, it transforms, it breaks apart and reassembles in forms that are simultaneously recognizable and utterly different from what came before. The fall of the fortress is not the death of the movement, but it is the end of something real and important, and the ending deserves to be told with the care it requires. Hulagu Khan arrived in Persia in 1253. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan, the younger brother of the great Khan Mongol, and he had been dispatched westward with a mandate of extraordinary scope. To complete the Mongol subjugation of the Islamic world, to destroy the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, to push Mongol power to the shores of the Mediterranean if the momentum allowed. He was a commander of considerable sophistication, operating within a military system that was, by the middle of the 13th century, the most effective the world had ever seen. The Mongol way of war had evolved over half a century of near-continuous conquest into something that combined mobility, logistics, psychological warfare, and siege technology in ways that no single opponent could counter on all fronts simultaneously. They moved faster than armies were supposed to move. Their supply systems were more flexible than conventional military wisdom said supply systems could be. Their siege engineers, drawn from Chinese and Persian and Islamic traditions, could reduce fortifications that would have held indefinitely against armies lacking that expertise. And their approach to resistance was calibrated with a brutal precision. Cities that submitted were treated with relative clemency, their populations and infrastructure preserved for incorporation into the Mongol system. Cities that resisted were destroyed so completely and so publicly that the next city in the path of the army faced a clear and vivid object lesson in the cost of defiance. The assassins had spent a century and a half building a system specifically designed to resist conventional military pressure. The mountain fortresses, the distributed network, the psychological arsenal of targeted violence and cultivated fear. Against every previous adversary, these tools had worked, had made the cost of eliminating the order prohibitively high, had produced the accommodations and the lifted sieges and the wary coexistences that allowed the movement to survive and function. Against the Mongols, the calculation was different in almost every respect. The Persian Grand Master in 1253 was Rukn-ad-Din Kursha, who had recently succeeded his father in circumstances that were themselves complicated and somewhat undignified. He was young, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, and by every account that survives he was a man of ordinary rather than exceptional abilities, competent enough in normal times, but not possessed of the particular combination of strategic vision, personal authority, and cold-nerved resolve that the situation now demanded. He knew the Mongols were coming. The intelligence network that the assassins maintained across the Islamic world had been providing information about the Mongol advance for years. He knew what had happened to the cities in the Mongol path: Samarkand, Merv, Nishapur, Balkh, great cities of the Islamic world reduced to rubble and ash, their populations killed or enslaved, their libraries and mosques and markets obliterated so completely that some of them never recovered. He knew that the traditional assassin response to military pressure, retire into the mountains, outlast the siege, wait for the enemy's attention to move elsewhere, assumed an enemy who had limits on how long they could maintain pressure, limits on how much they were willing to spend. The Mongols, who had been conducting sustained campaigns across Eurasia for 50 years, had a very different relationship to patience and expenditure than the Seljuk commanders who had failed to take Alamut in the previous century. Kursha's response was to try every available diplomatic avenue simultaneously, which reflects either genuine strategic sophistication or simple desperation, and is probably both. He sent envoys to the Mongol court with messages of submission and offers of cooperation. He sent his younger brother to Hulagu's camp as a gesture of good faith. He began, apparently, to dismantle some of the outlying fortifications in the assassin network as a demonstration of compliance, an act that his subordinates regarded as catastrophic, and that probably was, since it removed defensive assets before any genuine accommodation had been secured. The Mongol response to these gestures was not precisely hostile. Hulagu received the envoys. He accepted the brothers' presence at his court. He sent back messages that were encouraging enough to suggest the possibility of a negotiated outcome without actually committing to anything. he continued advancing. This is a pattern that recurs throughout the Mongol approach to the Islamic world, the use of diplomatic engagement not as genuine negotiation, but as a way of buying time and maintaining the target's passivity while the military preparations continued. The Mongols were extraordinarily sophisticated practitioners of the false accommodation. They had learned, from decades of conquest, that an enemy who believes negotiation is possible is an enemy who delays mobilization, who maintains defensive positions rather than going on the offensive, who waits for diplomatic outcomes that will not come until the Mongol forces are already in position to make resistance futile. Persia waited. The Mongols advanced, and in the autumn of 1256, Hulagu's armies appeared in the valleys below the assassin fortress network in force too overwhelming to have any illusions about. The siege of Alamut lasted, in its final form, a matter of weeks. Not because the fortress was easy to take, it was not, and the Mongol forces paid a real cost in time and effort to achieve what they achieved, but because Persia, after a period of watching the Mongol siege works advance with the terrible patience of a force that had all the time and all the resources it needed, made the decision to surrender. The decision was not cowardice, exactly. It was a rational assessment of an impossible situation. The fortress could hold for a time. The water supplies were adequate, the grain stores sufficient for months. But Hulagu had demonstrated at other fortresses in the network. Several of the outlying castles had already fallen, some by storm, some by negotiation, that the outcome was not in question. Only the cost and the timing. A garrison that held out to the end invited the kind of total destruction the Mongols practiced against resistors. A garrison that surrendered in time might negotiate better terms, the lives of the inhabitants, the preservation of at least some of what had been built. Persia surrendered Alamut in November or December of 1256. He presented himself to Hulagu with the formal gestures of submission. He was initially treated with a degree of courtesy that suggested his calculation might have been correct. He was kept alive, was sent westward toward the Great Khan's court in Mongolia, was held in a state of privileged captivity that looked, from the outside, like it might eventually produce some kind of accommodation. It did not. He was killed en route, reportedly on the orders of the Great Khan, who had no particular use for a captive Ismaili Grand Master, and considerable reasons to regard his continued existence as a political complication. The exact circumstances of his death vary between sources. The fact of it does not. The Mongols, having accepted the surrender, proceeded to do what the Mongols did. The fortress of Alamut was thoroughly sacked. The famous library, the collection that Hassan had built over decades, one of the finest in Persia, containing manuscripts on theology, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and the esoteric teachings of the Ismaili tradition that existed nowhere else, was destroyed. Some accounts suggest that Hulagu's advisor, the Persian historian Juvaini, was given time to go through the library and save specific manuscripts before the rest was burned. Juvaini himself confirms this in his chronicle, noting that he removed books and instruments before the remainder was set to fire. What he saved was a fraction of what was lost. Most of the Ismaili theological literature that Hassan and his successors had produced at Alamut is simply gone, lost not in the slow attrition of neglect and time, but in a single deliberate act of erasure. The other fortresses of the Persian network fell in the months that followed, some by the same combination of siege pressure and negotiated surrender that had taken Alamut, some by storm. The communities that had sustained them, the farmers in the valleys, the scholars in the libraries, the missionaries in their cells across the wider network, were killed, dispersed, absorbed, or driven into hiding. The infrastructure of the Persian assassin movement, the physical apparatus that Hassan had spent decades constructing, was gone within a year of the first Mongol army appearing in the valleys below. But the people were not all gone, and the people carried within them something that no army could sack. This is the moment in the assassin's story where the conventional narrative usually ends, with the fall of the fortress, the destruction of the library, the death of the Grand Master. It is a clean ending, dramatically satisfying, the kind of conclusion that a story wants to have, the final image that allows the audience to close the book. But it is not where the story actually ends, and the part that comes after the fall is, in some ways, the most remarkable part of all. Because what happened to the Ismaili movement after 1256, the way it survived, transformed, dispersed, and eventually reconstituted itself, is a story of institutional resilience that has very few parallels in the history of religious movements anywhere in the world. The survivors scattered. This is the first and most important fact. Not everyone in the assassin network was killed by the Mongols. The Persian network was devastated, but the Syrian branch remained intact. The Mongol advance had not yet reached the Jabal Bara, and Sinan's successors continued to operate their fortresses for another 2 decades after the fall of Alamut. Communities of Ismaili believers in Persia, in Iraq, in Central Asia, went underground, reverted to the practice of taqiyya, the deliberate concealment of religious identity that the Shia tradition had developed as a survival mechanism over centuries of persecution. They maintained their beliefs privately, passed them to their children, waited, and crucially. This is the point that most accounts of the assassin's fall miss entirely, the Imamite continued. The spiritual authority of the Ismaili movement was not located in Alamut or in any physical structure. It was located in the person of the Imam, the divinely guided descendant of Ali and Fatima, the living link between the human world and the sacred. The Imam was not Kursha, the Grand Master of the military order. He was a separate figure, the spiritual head of the broader Ismaili community of which the assassins were one, particularly militarized expression. And when Alamut fell and Kursha was killed, the Imam, whoever he was in that generation, the sources are not entirely clear, survived, went into hiding. Continued, this is the thread that connects the assassins of the mountain fortresses to the Ismaili community that exists in the world today. The thread does not pass through any fortress. It passes through a lineage of human beings, each one the successor of the last, each one carrying the spiritual authority that Hassan had invoked when he built his order on the foundation of devotion to the hidden Imam's eventual return. The Syrian branch held on for another generation. The fortresses of the Jabal Bahra, Masyaf, Kaf, Kawabi and the others continued to function after the fall of Alamut, continuing to maintain their complicated relationships with the surrounding powers. But the geopolitical landscape of Syria was itself changing rapidly in the second half of the 13th century, and not in ways that favoured the assassin's survival. The Mongols eventually reached Syria too, briefly occupying Damascus in 1260 before being defeated by the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt at the Battle of Ain Jalut, one of the few military defeats the Mongols suffered in this period, and a pivotal moment in the history of the Islamic world. The Mamluks, a dynasty of former slave soldiers who had seized power in Egypt, now emerged as the dominant power in the Levant, replacing both the Mongol threat and the declining Crusader states as the defining force in the region. The Mamluks were Sunni. Aggressively, orthodoxly, institutionally Sunni. And their attitude toward the Syrian assassins was considerably less accommodating than the complicated pragmatic coexistence that the Crusader states and even some of the Ayyubid rulers had maintained. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars, arguably the most formidable military and political figure of 13th century Islam, had a clear and consistent policy toward the Syrian assassins. Not destruction, exactly, but absorption. Subordination. The conversion of an independent political power into a tool of the Mamluk state. Over the course of the 1260s and 1270s, Baybars systematically brought the Syrian assassin fortresses under Mamluk control, not by military conquest in most cases, but by the same methods the assassins had used on others. Pressure. Negotiation from a position of overwhelming strength. The replacement of assassin-appointed commanders with Mamluk-appointed ones. The redirection of the order's operational capacity toward targets that served Mamluk rather than Ismaili interests. The Syrian assassins became, in effect, a tool of Mamluk policy. Their blade, which had for a century and a half been directed by the strategic logic of the Ismaili cause, was now directed by the strategic logic of a Sunni sultanate that had little interest in Ismaili theology and a great deal of interest in having a reliable instrument of targeted violence available for geopolitical use. There is something almost poetically ironic about this outcome. The organisation that Hassan had built specifically to resist the domination of Sunni powers, specifically to protect the Ismaili community from exactly the kind of political subordination that rendered minority communities powerless, had become an instrument of the most aggressively orthodox Sunni power of the age. The blade remained. The hand that held it had changed entirely. The Mamluks used the Syrian assassins for several decades, most famously in an attempted assassination of Edward of England, the future Edward I, at Acre in 1272. Edward survived, suffering a wound from a poisoned blade, and the incident contributed significantly to the European image of the assassins as exotic, unstoppable, and specifically dangerous to Christian rulers. But by the end of the 13th century, as the Crusader states collapsed entirely with the fall of Acre in 1291, the Mamluk need for the Syrian assassins as a geopolitical instrument declined. The Crusader states that had provided so much of the context for the order's Syrian operations no longer existed. The landscape they had navigated was gone. The Syrian fortresses were fully absorbed into the Mamluk administrative structure. The communities that had sustained them were dispersed into the general population of Syrian villages, maintaining their Ismaili identity privately, quietly, in the manner of people who have learned through generations of experience that survival sometimes requires invisibility. Now let us talk about the word, because in some ways the most durable legacy of the assassins, the legacy that has outlasted the fortresses and the imamate disputes and the theological traditions and nearly everything else, is a single word that crossed the Mediterranean on the lips of crusaders and traders and travellers and took root in the languages of Europe with the tenacity of something that fills a need that previously had no name. Assassin, the word entered European languages in the 12th and 13th centuries, carried westward by the returning crusaders who had encountered the Syrian order in the Levant. In its earliest European forms it referred specifically to the members of the order, the Hashishin, as they were known in the Arabic sources, a term of abuse that had attached itself to the Ismaili militants in a way that was never quite accurate but proved impossible to dislodge. The Crusaders brought it back as assassin, or hassissin, or variations thereof, each language adapting the syllables to its own phonology. In European usage, the word quickly shed its specific historical referent and became a general term for a certain kind of killer. Not a soldier who kills openly in battle, not a murderer who kills for personal passion or private gain, but someone who kills for political reasons, deliberately and covertly, as an instrument of calculated strategy. This was a concept that European languages had not previously had a single precise word for, and the arrival of assassin filled that gap with enough force that it has never been displaced. The transformation of the word from a specific historical reference to a general conceptual category is itself a kind of testimony to what the assassins had achieved. They had practiced a form of political violence so distinctive, so recognizable, so precisely defined in its methods and objectives that it required its own name. Every language that borrowed the word was implicitly acknowledging that what the assassins had done was not just a historical event, but a phenomenon, a type of thing that could occur and had occurred and presumably could occur again, and that therefore deserved to be named. The legend that grew around the word in Europe was considerably more elaborate and considerably less accurate than the reality it nominally described. Marco Polo's account, written in the late 13th century based on hearsay, and the travellers' tales of the Silk Road, rather than any direct encounter with the order, gave European imagination the Garden of Paradise, the hashish, the beautiful maidens, the drugged young men shown a foretaste of heaven, and sent out to kill for the promise of its return. This account was almost certainly fictional in its specifics, but it had the quality of a story that people wanted to believe, that satisfied certain needs of the European imagination about the exotic and dangerous East, and it spread and persisted and generated its own literary and artistic tradition. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the European image of the assassins had separated almost entirely from the historical reality and become a kind of symbolic figure, the perfect killer, motivated by fanatical devotion rather than ordinary human interest, capable of anything, appearing anywhere, impossible to deter because unafraid of death. This figure appeared in chronicles and travel accounts, and eventually in literature, each iteration further from the historical Ismaili community of the Jabal Bahra and the Alborz, each one more deeply embedded in the symbolic vocabulary of European ideas about the Orient. The irony is that the Europeans, in constructing this legend, had preserved something real, even while distorting the specifics beyond recognition. The assassins had genuinely been an organization motivated by devotion rather than ordinary self-interest. The fidai had genuinely been willing to die. The order had genuinely achieved a form of reach and psychological impact disproportionate to its actual size that made it seem, to those who encountered its effects without understanding its mechanisms, to be something almost supernatural. The legend exaggerated and distorted these realities, but the realities were there, underneath the distortion, waiting for anyone patient enough to look for them. The Ismaili community did not disappear. This is perhaps the most important fact about the long aftermath of the assassins, and the one most consistently overlooked in accounts that treat 1256 as a simple ending. The imamate, the line of imams tracing back through Ali to the Prophet Muhammad himself, continued in hiding for several centuries after the fall of Alamut. The imams moved carefully, concealing their identity, maintaining connection with dispersed Ismaili communities through networks of missionary contacts that had survived the Mongol destruction in fragments and rebuilt themselves slowly over generations. The community in Persia, in Syria, in India, where Ismaili missionaries had been active since the medieval period, maintained their identity, passed their beliefs to their children, waited with the patient faith of people who had been waiting for a very long time. In the 19th century, the imamate emerged from concealment. The imam of that time, a man named Hassan-i Sabbah, was recognized by the Persian court with the title Aga Khan, a Turkic honorific meaning something like Lord of Lords. He subsequently came into conflict with the Persian government and eventually fled to British India, where he established himself as the public leader of the global Ismaili community. His descendants have held the title since, The current Aga Khan, Shah Karim al-Husseini, the fourth to bear the title, is the 49th Imam in the Ismaili line, as counted from Ali. He is one of the wealthiest individuals in the world, leads a global community of several million Ismaili Muslims, and runs one of the largest private development organizations on earth through the Aga Khan Development Network, which operates schools, hospitals, and economic development programs across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The Ismaili community today has no relationship to political violence. The tradition of the fidai, the targeted killing, the fortress network, all of that is centuries gone. A historical episode in the long life of a religious tradition that has taken many forms and will presumably take many more. The Aga Khan himself is a figure of remarkable modernity, educated at Harvard, deeply engaged with questions of development economics and cultural preservation, known for his horses and his architecture programs, and his extraordinarily sophisticated engagement with the question of how a minority religious tradition survives and flourishes in the contemporary world. But the thread is unbroken. From Hassan-i Sabbah's mountain to the Aga Khan's Geneva headquarters, the line of imams has continued without interruption for 13 centuries. The fortresses fell. The political movement was destroyed. The library was burned. But the living chain of authority that Hassan had invoked when he built his order, the chain running from Ali through the Fatimids, through the Ismaili tradition to the hidden imam whose return would vindicate everything. That chain was not cut by the Mongols. It bent. It went underground. It survived in the only way that things of genuine depth survive, by being rooted in something that stone walls and Mongol armies cannot reach. What, then, do we make of the assassins? Standing at this distance, with the whole arc of their story visible from beginning to end, from the theological fault lines of early Islam to the cold mountain of Alamut, from the age of the blade to the Mongol storm, from the scattered survivors to the global community of the 21st century. What do we actually see? We see first an organization of extraordinary effectiveness that achieved what it achieved through means that we're genuinely innovative and remain genuinely instructive. Hassan-i Sabbah understood things about the relationship between power and perception, between violence and fear, between the visible and the invisible, that most military and political thinkers of his era had not formulated clearly. He built something that leveraged those understandings with a precision that produced results wildly disproportionate to the resources invested. The assassins were never a large organization. They were never wealthy. They never controlled significant territory in the conventional sense, and yet they shaped the political landscape of the medieval Islamic world for nearly 2 centuries. The leverage was extraordinary, and it was achieved through intelligence, through thinking more carefully and more originally about the nature of power than the larger forces surrounding them. We see, second, a movement born from genuine suffering and genuine marginalization that found in violence a tool it could not afford to put down. The Ismaili community that produced the assassins was a real community, with real theological convictions and real political grievances, and real experience of persecution. The violence was not random. It was not nihilistic. It grew from a specific historical situation in which a minority community facing existential threat chose to fight back with the weapons available to it. Whether that choice was right, whether the killing was justified, whether the ends warranted the means, is a question that each person who encounters this history must answer for themselves. But it is a question that deserves to be asked with the full context in view, not with the legend substituted for the reality. We see, third, the extraordinary durability of religious identity and spiritual community. The assassins as a political and military organisation are gone, but the people who sustained that organisation and the tradition of faith that gave it meaning have survived everything. The Mongols, the Mamluks, the long centuries of hiding, the modern world's indifference to medieval religious distinctions. The Ismaili community exists today because human beings are capable of maintaining belief and identity and community across unimaginable spans of time and through catastrophes that should, by any rational calculation, have extinguished them. And we see, finally, the strange and particular immortality of a word. Assassin, it outlived the organisation it named. It outlived the language it was originally spoken in. It crossed oceans and centuries and attached itself to a concept, deliberate political killing as a strategic instrument, that every age has found occasion to use. Every time the word appears in a newspaper or a history book or a political analysis, the echo of Hassan-i Sabbah's cold mountain is there, faint and distorted beyond recognition, but present. A ghost that became a word that became a concept that became part of the permanent vocabulary of human political life. That is a strange kind of immortality. But for an organisation that built its entire power on the relationship between the visible and the invisible, between what exists in the world and what exists in the mind, perhaps it is the most fitting kind of all. And now, if you are still with us, if your eyes are still open and the story has not yet carried you all the way under, we hope it has been worth the journey. From the cracked Islamic world of the 11th century to the cold heights of the Alborz, through the complicated politics of the Syrian mountains and the shadow of the Mongol storm, all the way to the long quiet aftermath and the unbroken thread of faith that runs to the present day. The assassins were real and more human and more complex than the legend allowed. And their story, the genuine story, stripped of the Garden of Paradise and the hashish and the exotic fantasy, is more interesting than the legend has ever been. If tonight's journey through 1,000 years of shadow and mountain and blade was something you enjoyed, we would love to know. Leave a like if the story found you where you needed it. Subscribe if you want more nights like this one, and there are many more stories waiting, many more worlds to drift into as the lights go low and the night settles in around you. Leave a comment too if you are still awake enough to do it. Tell us where you are in the world right now, and what time the darkness found you tonight. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that this story has travelled, that it crossed time zones and oceans and found you in your particular corner of the night, wherever that is. Now let your shoulders drop the last of their weight. Let the story dissolve into the dark behind your eyes, the way stories do when they have done their work. The mountain is quiet. The blade is still. The long watch is over. Sleep well. You have earned it.